The morning it happened, the sky over Redstone Crossing was the color of a bad bruise. That ugly yellow purple that settles in before a storm decides what it wants to be. Cole Mercer noticed it when he stepped out of Halverson's feed store with a 50-pound sack of oat grain slung over one shoulder and the receipt folded into his breast pocket. He noticed it, and then he forgot about it, because the commotion on the south end of Main Street was louder than anything the sky was doing. There were maybe 40 people gathered in front of the old Dennison building, the one with the crumbling brick facade and the rotted wooden steps that the town council had been threatening to fix for 3 years. Some of them Cole recognized. Cal Pruitt, who ran the tannery. Mabel Oates, the postmaster's wife, standing with her arms crossed, like she was watching something she disapproved of, but wasn't going to leave. A cluster of ranch hands from the Barlow outfit, men Cole had played cards with a handful of times, men who were now watching the steps of that building with a particular kind of attention, the kind that made Cole slow his stride. He set the grain sack down against the side of Halverson's porch and moved toward the crowd. The man standing on the Dennison steps was named Gideon Frey. Cole knew him by reputation more than anything else. Frey worked as a debt collector for the Consolidated Territorial Mining Company, a company that had its fingers in half the territory and its boot on the other half. He was a tall man, lean in the way that made people think of something desiccated, something that had been left out in the sun too long. He wore a gray suit that had probably cost more than Cole made in a good month, and he held a ledger in one hand and a thin wooden gavel in the other. "The estate of the late Douglas Hart," Frey was saying, his voice carrying the flat professional calm of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again, held outstanding debts at the time of his death totaling $942, as recorded and certified by the offices of Consolidated Territorial Mining Company and witnessed before Justice Aldrich Boone on the 14th of March. Cole stopped at the edge of the crowd. On the steps behind Frey stood a woman. She was younger than Cole had expected, mid-20s maybe, though the kind of tired she was wearing made it hard to be certain. She was thin in a way that suggested months of not eating quite enough, and she was dressed in a gray dress that had been mended so many times at the seams you could trace the repairs like a map. Her dark hair was pinned back without any particular care, and her face was very still. Not calm, still. There was a difference. Calm meant a person had made peace with something. Still meant a person had shut down the parts of themselves that would show what they were feeling, because showing it would cost too much. She was holding a baby against her chest. The infant couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 months old. Cole looked at the baby. Then he looked at Frey. Then he looked at the ledger in Frey's hand. "Under Territorial Debt Settlement Statute," Frey continued, "the labor and services of Mrs. Elena Hart, widow, are hereby offered in public auction to satisfy the aforementioned debts. The successful bidder will be entitled to a period of indentured service of no less than 3 years, terms to be negotiated and certified by the Office of Justice Boone. The child," Frey paused there, consulting his ledger, "being a dependent of the estate, will accompany the mother under the same terms of service." Someone in the crowd said something Cole didn't catch. A few people shifted. Mabel Oates looked away from the steps for a moment, then looked back, and her face had gone very tight around the mouth. Cole said quietly to the man standing next to him, a hardware dealer named Spivey, "Is this legal?" Spivey glanced at him sideways. "Frey says it is." "I'm not asking what Frey says." Spivey shrugged, the kind of shrug that meant, "I don't want any part of this conversation." "Boone signed off on it." Cole had heard of Aldrich Boone. Most people in the territory had. The man had been a justice of the peace for 11 years and had made remarkably consistent decisions in favor of whichever party had the most money on the table. That wasn't a secret. It was just a fact that people had stopped being surprised by, which was its own kind of problem. "Opening bid," Frey said, "is set at $100. 3 hands went up almost simultaneously. Cole recognized 2 of the men. One was a rancher named Bart Stills, heavy-shouldered and red-faced, who had a place about 12 miles east of town and a reputation among his hired hands for making their lives difficult in ways that stopped just short of leaving marks. The other was a man in an expensive coat whose name Cole didn't know, but who had the look of a company man, someone who worked for Consolidated, sent down to make sure the auction went the way Consolidated wanted it to go. The third man Cole didn't recognize at all. He was younger, wearing trail clothes. and he was watching Elena Hart with a kind of fixed attention that made Cole's jaw tighten. 100 to Mr. Stills, Frey said. Do I hear 110? The bidding went up in irregular jumps. Stills was methodical about it, calling out his numbers in a flat, unhurried voice like he was negotiating for cattle. The company man pushed him a few times, and each time Stills came back. The younger man dropped out around 140, which was when the numbers started getting serious. Cole stood at the edge of the crowd and watched Elena Hart's face. She wasn't looking at the bidders. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere over the heads of the crowd, maybe at the hills beyond the edge of town, maybe at nothing at all. She had the baby held tight against her chest, and one of her hands was moving in small, repetitive circles on the infant's back. Not a conscious gesture, Cole thought. Just something her body was doing without her permission. Some fundamental reflex of a mother trying to comfort a child while every external circumstance was as far from comforting as it was possible to get. The bidding reached 200. Cole thought about what he had in his pocket. He had the receipt from Halverson's, which meant he'd just spent $37 on feed. He had $14 in cash, which was what remained of what he'd budgeted for the week's supplies. He had the ranch, the actual property, the land and the buildings, the livestock, but that wasn't liquid. That wasn't something you spent at an auction on a Tuesday morning without thinking it through first. He thought about the way Elena Hart's hand was moving in circles on her daughter's back. He thought about the word Frey had used, indentured. 240, said Stills. 250, said the company man. Cole pulled out the $14 in his pocket and looked at it. $14 was not going to win this auction. He put it back. There was a bank in Redstone Crossing, Territorial First, 2 blocks north of where Cole was standing. He had an account there. He had been building that account for 4 years, setting aside what he could from cattle sales and from the timber work he did in the winters. The balance at last count had been roughly $600. It was the reserve against bad seasons, against equipment failures, against the 100 ways a frontier ranch could go wrong faster than you could fix it. It was what stood between him and losing the property the way his father had lost it, the way too many men he'd known had lost theirs. $600 was not enough to rebuild if the ranch had a real catastrophe. It was barely enough to patch one. 280, said Stills. Cole was already moving. He went to the bank at something close to a jog, which was not a pace he generally adopted in public. The teller, a young man named Frederick, who looked alarmed whenever anything happened faster than he expected, stared at Cole as he came through the door. I need to make a withdrawal, Cole said. $550. Frederick stared at him. Mr. Mercer, that's nearly the full... I know what it is, Cole said. I need it in bills, whatever you have that's easiest to carry. Frederick looked at him for another moment, then went to get the branch manager. The branch manager, a man named Garfield Pruitt, who had the kind of face that suggested he'd been born worrying, came out from the back with his reading glasses on his nose and a careful expression on his face. Cole, he said. Something happening? Auction on the Denison Steps, Cole said. I need $550 out of my account, and I need it now, not in 20 minutes. Pruitt looked at him steadily. Something shifted in his expression, not quite understanding, but something adjacent to it. He took off his glasses, folded them, and said to Frederick, Get Mr. Mercer his money. By the time Cole got back to the Denison Steps, the bidding had reached $310, and Stills was looking like he'd decided to end it soon. The company man had stepped back. Either he'd hit his ceiling, or he'd gotten what he needed from running the price up. The young stranger had drifted to the edge of the crowd. It was mostly Stills now, with Frey prompting in that flat professional voice, and the crowd watching with the particular silence of people who have concluded that the outcome is settled. Elena Hart had stopped looking at the hills. She was looking at her daughter's face now, and her expression was the kind that Cole knew he was going to remember for a long time, regardless of what happened next. $320, said Stills. $560, Cole said. The crowd turned. Frey stopped mid-breath. Stills turned around with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who was making sure he'd heard correctly before he decided how to react. Cole was still breathing harder than he liked from the walk back. He had the money in his breast pocket, folded together with the feed receipt. He looked at Frey and said, $560, cash. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Stills said, You've lost your mind, Mercer. Maybe, Cole said. He looked at Frey. That's my bid. Frey consulted his ledger, then looked at Stills. Stills looked at Cole for a long moment. Cole waited. He knew Stills had money, more money than Cole, probably, but he also knew that there was a threshold at which the stubbornness of a bid became more about the money than the principle, and 560 was a number designed to sit past that threshold. Stills wasn't going to spend $500 on principle in front of 40 people if the alternative was letting the whole thing go and pretending it didn't matter to him. Stills made a sound in the back of his throat. Then he stepped back. $560, Frey said, in that same flat voice. He looked out at the crowd. Any further bids? Nothing. Sold, Frey said. He didn't look happy about it exactly, but he didn't look unhappy. He just looked like a man doing a transaction. Mr. Mercer, Cole said. Cole Mercer. My spread's up on the Harrow Creek Road. Frey made a note in his ledger. Mr. Mercer, the terms of service will need to be... I'm going to stop you there, Cole said. He moved through the crowd to the base of the steps and looked up at Frey. I paid $942 worth of debt with $560 of my money. That doesn't add up to indentured service. That adds up to approximately 60% of a cleared debt. Frey blinked. The auction was for the full term of... The auction was to settle debts, Cole said. I want to see the documentation, the actual statute you're citing. I want to read the language myself. There was a long pause. This was the thing about Gideon Frey. He was a confident man in a crowd, but he was also, at some level, a man whose confidence depended on other people not pushing back with specific questions. Cole had spent enough time around enough operations like Consolidated Territorial to know that a significant percentage of what they did was legal only in the sense that nobody had tested it hard enough yet. The balance of the debt, Cole said, is $382. I'll pay that balance on a repayment schedule, documented and witnessed, with Mrs. Hart's work at my property constituting fair market compensation to be applied against the remaining amount. Any arrangement beyond that is going to require a lawyer who doesn't work for Consolidated and a judge who doesn't owe Boone a favor. The crowd was very quiet. Cole looked up at Elena Hart. She was watching him now, not with gratitude, but he noticed that, filed it away. She was watching him the way a person watches something they haven't decided about yet, assessing, wary. He didn't blame her for that either. They didn't speak until they were clear of Main Street. Cole had the grain sack back on his shoulder. He'd retrieved it from Halverson's porch on the way past. And Elena Hart was walking beside him with the baby held against her chest and a battered canvas bag over one arm that apparently contained everything she owned. She had retrieved it from somewhere inside the Dennison building while Frey was completing the paperwork, and Cole had not asked about it. His wagon was hitched at the far end of the commercial block, a working vehicle in every sense of the word. The kind of wagon where you could still see the repairs from 3 separate incidents if you knew where to look. He hoisted the grain sack into the bed, then turned to help Elena up to the seat. She didn't take his hand. She managed it herself, one arm still holding the baby, the canvas bag wedged somehow, getting up onto the seat with a kind of efficient determination that told him she'd learned not to accept help she wasn't certain she could afford. He went around to the driver's side and climbed up. For a minute, neither of them said anything. Cole took up the reins. I'm going to ask you something, Elena said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, controlled. Go ahead, Cole said. Why? He kept his eyes on the road ahead. The wagon rolled out of town at an easy pace. The horse, a bay mare named Augusta, who had no interest in moving faster than necessary, taking the north road without being told. Cole had made this drive enough times that Augusta knew the way. Why what specifically? Cole said. Don't do that, Elena said. Don't answer a question with a question to give yourself more time. I've had enough of men who do that. He glanced at her sideways. She was looking straight ahead, the baby. He'd heard someone at the auction refer to her as Clara, making small sounds against her mother's collarbone. Fair enough, he said. The honest answer is that I don't have a clean one. I saw what was happening and I didn't like it. That's most of it. That's not a reason to spend $560. No, he agreed. It's not. Elena was quiet for a moment. You don't know me. No. I could be... She stopped. Started again. My husband left debts. That's not a small thing. It says something about a man's judgment when his debts outlive him. I've met men with good judgment who still died in debt, Cole said, and I've met men with terrible judgment who died rich. I don't generally assume one implies the other. Another silence. The road out of town ran north along a creek bed, cottonwoods on either side, the hills building up in the distance. Cole let the silence sit. He'd learned a long time ago that some people needed silence to decide whether they were going to keep their guard up, and pushing into that silence generally just made the guard go higher. The man who ran that auction, Elena said finally, Frey, he works for Consolidated. I know. My husband, Douglas, he worked for them. He was an assayer. He traveled to their claim sites and documented what the ore samples came back as, so they had records for the territorial filings. She paused. He started bringing notes home about 8 months before he died. He didn't tell me what they were about, not at first. He wasn't always easy to talk to, but I saw some of what he was writing, and it wasn't what I'd expect to see in normal assay records. Cole said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road. He was documenting something, Elena said. I don't know the whole of it. He died before he told me. Another pause. Longer. They said it was an accident. He fell from a ridge out near their copper wash claim, but Douglas knew that ridge. He'd been out there a dozen times. The wagon rolled on. Augusta's hooves were quiet on the packed dirt road. Mrs. Hart, Cole said, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it without reading too much into it either way. I bought your contract this morning because I didn't want to see what was going to happen to you otherwise. That's the full extent of what I know about your situation. Whatever else is in it, the notes, your husband, Consolidated. I don't know any of that, and I'm not going to pretend to have a plan for it. Elena was watching him again with that measuring quality. What I do have, Cole said, is a working ranch that is about 45% less funded than it was this morning, a spare room that's been storing lumber for 2 years, and a hired hand named Otis who is going to look at me like I've grown a second head when we get back. That's where we're at. Elena looked down at Clara. The baby had fallen asleep somewhere in the last mile. The room with the lumber, Elena said. I'll move it out today, Cole said. She nodded. Once. Short and definite, the way someone nods when they're not agreeing so much as accepting a reality and deciding to work with it. I can cook, she said. I can do accounts. I kept the household books for Douglas, and before we were married, I clerked for a land office in Mill Haven for 2 years. That's useful, Cole said honestly. His accounts were a disaster. He knew where his money went in general terms, but not in specific ones, which had been fine when there wasn't much money to track, and was increasingly not fine as the ranch grew. I'm not helpless, Elena said. It didn't come out defensive exactly. It came out more like information she felt obligated to provide. I didn't think you were. Most men in your position would assume I was. Most men in my position wouldn't have been at that auction, Cole said. That stopped her for a moment. He saw her absorb it, not with any particular warmth, but with the careful way of someone who is taking in a piece of information and trying to figure out where it fits in their understanding of how the world works. The ranch was called the Mercer Place, which was unimaginative but accurate. Cole's father had built it 30 years ago on a section of land at the base of a ridge called Harrow's Back, named after a man named Harrow who had done something significant in that location and whose first name history had apparently declined to record. The original structure, a small cabin and a single outbuilding, had been extended twice, once by Cole's father and once by Cole himself, until it had grown into something that could generously be called a compound, a main house with 4 rooms, a barn that was structurally sound but aesthetically rough, a smokehouse, and a bunkhouse that currently housed Otis Greer, Cole's only full-time hand. Otis was in the yard when the wagon came in, working on a section of fence rail that had come loose from its post. He was a man of about 50, compact and weathered, who had worked for Cole's father before he'd worked for Cole, and who communicated most things through expression rather than language. When he saw Cole come in with a woman and an infant on the wagon seat, his expression communicated quite a lot. This is Mrs. Hart, Cole said, climbing down from the wagon. She'll be staying here for a time. Otis looked at Elena, looked at the baby, looked at Cole. His expression said, I have questions. I'll explain later, Cole said. Otis's expression said, "You'd better." But he came around and helped with the horse without further commentary, which was more than Cole had expected, and which confirmed something he'd always thought about Otis, that whatever his opinions were, he knew when to hold them. Elena climbed down from the wagon seat with the same careful efficiency she'd shown getting up. She stood in the yard and looked at the buildings and the hills and the sky. Clara was awake again, looking around with the wide, unfocused attention of very young infants encountering new things. "The spare room's through the side door," Cole said. "I'll get the lumber moved out before evening." Elena turned to look at him. In the full afternoon light, he could see her more clearly than he'd been able to in the chaos of the auction. The dark circles under her eyes, the particular texture of exhaustion that had settled into her face, the way she was holding herself that suggested she was operating on some kind of internal reserve that she was very carefully not letting run out. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Cole," he said. "Please." A very brief hesitation. "Cole." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to be honest with you about something." "I'd prefer that." "I don't know what to make of you," she said. "I don't know why you did what you did this morning, and I don't believe you've told me the whole of it, even though what you told me may be true as far as it goes. I have been in situations where a man helped me and then used that help as a reason to expect things from me, and I want to be clear. I'm not in a position where I can afford to let that happen again." Cole looked at her. He thought about various things he could say to that, reassurances and explanations and protests. He settled on the simplest one. "That's fair," he said, "and reasonable. I don't have expectations. I have a room and some work that needs doing, and as far as I'm concerned, what happened this morning was my choice, not a debt you owe me." Elena was quiet for a moment. "We'll see," she said. It wasn't warm, but it was honest, and Cole thought that was probably better. "Boss." The spare room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, and had indeed been storing lumber, along with 2 broken pieces of equipment, a box of nails that had partially rusted, and an old saddle that Cole had been meaning to repair for a year and a half. He moved all of it out that afternoon, stacking the lumber against the side of the barn and carrying everything else to the storage shed. He swept the floor, found a clean blanket in the house, and came back with an oil lamp that he set on the windowsill. It wasn't much. He knew it wasn't much. Elena came in behind him and looked at it. She set her canvas bag down on the floor and stood in the middle of the room with Clara on her hip. "It'll do," she said. There was a pause. Cole moved toward the door. "Mr. Mayor, Cole." He stopped. "Did Frey say anything to you?" Elena said. "After you made your bid? After the crowd started to leave?" Cole thought back. He'd been dealing with the paperwork, with Frey's assistant and the documentation. But at some point, Frey had leaned in close enough to say something in a low voice, something Cole had noted and then set aside in the business of getting everything sorted. He'd said, "You should know that Mrs. Hart carries some complicated history, the kind of history that doesn't stay in the past." Cole had not answered him at the time. He just looked at him until Frey moved away. "He said something," Cole said. "Nothing worth repeating." Elena held his gaze. "He told you about Douglas. He implied there was something to know. He didn't say what." Something moved in her expressions. Relief, maybe, or something more complicated than relief. "You paid for my contract anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Cole thought about it. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her. This woman, with the sleeping baby and the battered bag, and the expression that had been carefully closed all day, and was, right now, just slightly less closed. "Because whatever Frey knows or doesn't know about your husband," Cole said, "it doesn't change what I saw on those steps. And I figure the rest of it, whatever the rest of it is, you'll tell me when you're ready to." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "It could get dangerous," she said. "Knowing." "I figured that," Cole said. "You figured that and you—" She stopped. Started again. "Do you not have any sense of self-preservation?" "Some," Cole said. "Not unlimited." She almost did something with her face that might have been close to a smile. It didn't quite make it, but the shape of it was there for a second, and then it was gone, and she looked down at Clara. "There's a box," she said, "at the bottom of the bag. It's wrapped in an old dress." She looked up. "When I'm ready to tell you, I'll show you what's in it." Cole nodded. "Whenever you are," he said, and left her to it. That evening, Otis made a fire in the yard and they sat around it, Cole, Otis, and Elena, with Clara asleep inside on the bed. And Cole told Otis what had happened in the town with about as much detail as he thought was necessary, which was most of it. Otis listened without interrupting, which for Otis was a sign of significant engagement. When Cole was done, Otis was quiet for a moment. "Consolidated Territorial," Otis said. "That's the hatch operation." Cole looked at him. "You know it?" "Know of it. Ran into one of their assay crews up near the Ridgecrest claims about 4 years back before I came on here." Otis poked at the fire with a stick. "They weren't running a clean operation then. Had 2 sets of books, was the talk. What they filed with the territory and what they actually pulled out of the ground." Cole thought about the box at the bottom of Elena's bag. "How big is Consolidated?" he asked. Otis made a face that suggested big didn't quite cover it. "Got interest from here clear to the coast. Mining, timber, some land holdings. Couple of the territorial officials have been on their payroll for years. Nothing provable, but everyone in the field knows." Including Boone. Including Boone." Otis looked at Cole. "You bought yourself something more than a housekeeper today, Cole." "I know." "Do you?" Cole watched the fire. "I know enough to know I don't know the full extent of it yet." Otis made a sound that communicated something between skepticism and grudging acceptance. "She seems like she can handle herself." "Yes," Cole said. "She does." From inside the house, very quietly, Clara made a small sound. Not a cry, just a presence. The unconscious announcement of a sleeping infant that she was there and breathing and small and entirely dependent on the people around her to keep the world from doing what it was apparently inclined to do. Cole listened to it. Then he looked back at the fire. He had $52 to his name, a ranch that needed more work than it was getting, and an obligation he'd taken on that morning that was considerably more complicated than it had appeared from 40 feet away in the crowd. He had a woman in the spare room who was carrying information that powerful people had already demonstrated they would do serious things to suppress. He did not regret the morning's decision. He wasn't certain that said anything particularly good about his judgment, but there it was. Otis stood up, stretched, and said goodnight. Cole sat by the fire until it burned down to coals, watching the hills in the dark and listening to the sound of the creek below the property. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and then stopped. He thought about what Elena had said. It could get dangerous. Knowing. He thought about the way she'd asked him why. Twice, in 2 different voices. And both times the question had contained something underneath it that wasn't really a question about him at all. It was a question about whether the world contained any reliable ground, any place where you could put your weight without it giving way. Whether anything that looked stable from a distance was actually stable when you got close enough to test it. He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did, really. The best you could do was try to be ground that didn't give way when it was tested, and see how far that took you. Cole Mercer kicked a last ember back into the fire ring, stood up, and went inside. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. So was the one after that. The first week passed the way most first weeks pass between strangers thrown together by circumstance. Carefully, with a great deal of unspoken negotiation about where the boundaries were and whether they would hold. Elena woke before Cole did. He discovered this on the second morning when he came out of his room at first light and found coffee already made on the stove, and Clara sitting propped in the corner of the kitchen bench with a folded blanket behind her back, watching the room with the ancient, considering gaze that very young infants sometimes have, as though they arrived in the world with opinions already formed and are simply waiting for the language to express them. Elena was at the table with a ledger, Cole's ledger, the household accounts he'd left on the shelf, open in front of her, working through it with a pencil. Cole stopped in the doorway. Elena looked up. She didn't seem startled. "Your grain costs are inconsistent," she said. "You're paying 2 different prices to 2 different suppliers for essentially the same product." "Good morning," Cole said. "Good morning." She looked back at the ledger. "Halverson charges you 37 cents per hundredweight more than the Millbrook feed store would. Halverson's is closer, which saves you time. But if you're making a run to town regardless, the difference over a year is—" She did a quick calculation. "About $14? Cole poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. He looked at the ledger, which she had apparently reorganized with light pencil marks along the margins indicating categories. "I've been buying from Halverson for 4 years. "I know. That's apparent." She wasn't saying it to be cutting. It was just a fact. There are a few other things like this. Nothing catastrophic, but the ranch is losing money in small amounts in 4 or 5 places that add up. How long did it take you to find that? About an hour last night, after Clara went down. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to a margin note. This is the largest one. You're paying property tax assessed at a value that's about 20% higher than comparable land in the county. I don't know if you've ever challenged that assessment, but it's the kind of thing where filing for a review often results in— Elena, Cole said. She stopped. Thank you, he said. Genuinely. But you don't have to earn your keep on the second day. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her posture shifted. Not relaxed exactly, but adjusted slightly, the way a person adjusts when they realize the ground they're standing on is not, in fact, going to move. Old habit, she said after a pause. I figured. Cole looked at the ledger. Walk me through it after breakfast. All of it. And she did, and that was more or less how the rhythm of the place started to establish itself. Otis, for his part, adapted faster than Cole had expected. Within 3 days, he'd arranged himself around the household's new shape without apparent difficulty. He ate breakfast at the main house now instead of in the bunkhouse. He had taken to Clara with the careful, slightly baffled affection of a man who had not spent much time around infants but was willing to learn, and he had twice carried firewood to Elena's room without being asked. Whatever his initial reservations had been, he'd set them aside. Cole respected that. The work on the ranch continued. There was always work on a ranch. Fence lines to check, cattle to move, equipment to repair, the ongoing negotiation with the land and the season that constituted the actual content of ranching life. Cole and Otis fell back into the familiar pattern of it, and Elena found her place in the parts of that pattern that didn't require physical strength she didn't have. The accounts, the planning, the kind of organizational work that Cole had always done badly and that she seemed to do almost without thinking. She also cooked, and she cooked well, not elaborately but competently, which was what mattered. The first time she put a proper meal on the table, roast chicken with root vegetables, cornbread that didn't fall apart, Otis ate 3 helpings and then looked mildly embarrassed about it. Elena didn't comment. Cole noticed that she generally didn't comment on things that didn't require comment, which was a quality he was coming to appreciate more than he would have expected. Clara grew louder. Not unhappily. She seemed to be a fundamentally good-natured baby who saved her real complaints for specific provocations. But she was increasingly interested in the world, and increasingly willing to announce that interest. Cole found himself in odd moments holding her while Elena had both hands occupied, getting acquainted with the specific weight and warmth of a small person who has decided you are not a threat and therefore requires nothing from you except the basic service of not dropping her. It was not an experience he had anticipated being part of his life at this point. He didn't find it unwelcome. It was on the 9th day that Elena showed him the box. She came to find him in the barn in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold through the gaps in the siding and Otis had gone to check the east fence. She was carrying Clara against one hip and the canvas bag over the other shoulder, and her expression had the particular quality Cole had learned to read as I've decided something. You have time? She said. Yes. They sat on 2 overturned crates near the barn door, which gave them light enough to see. Elena set the bag on the floor between them, reached into it past a folded garment, and brought out what she'd described, a bundle wrapped in an old dress tied with a piece of cord. She set it on her knee and looked at it for a moment, and Cole waited. She untied the cord. Inside the dress were papers, a lot of papers, more than he'd expected, folded and rolled and organized with the careful density of someone who had been trying to fit too much into too small a space. Some of them were covered in a tight, cramped handwriting that Cole assumed was Douglas Hart's. Others were copies of documents, copied in the same hand. Columns of numbers, dates, location designations that meant nothing to Cole in themselves. Douglas worked for Consolidated for 6 years, Elena said. She kept her voice even. He was good at his job. He traveled to their claim sites across 3 counties, took samples, ran assays, filed reports with both Consolidated and the Territorial Mining Commission. She smoothed one of the papers on her knee. About 14 months before he died, he started noticing something wrong. Cole looked at the papers without touching them. What kind of wrong? The numbers they were filing with the Territorial Commission were different from the numbers he was reporting to Consolidated's own internal office, not by small amounts. She pointed to one of the columns. This is a claim out near Copperwash. Consolidated filed a grade report of 42% copper concentration on a vein with an estimated depth of 60 feet. Skeets. What Douglas actually reported, what his actual assay results showed, was 78% concentration with an estimated depth of more than 200 feet. Cole looked at the numbers. He wasn't an assayer, but he'd been around mining claims enough to understand what that gap meant. They were underreporting to the territory, massively, which affects the royalties they pay, which affects the land value they're assessed on. She set the paper down and picked up another. But it's not just royalties. If you're reporting a claim at 40% of its actual value to the Territorial Commission, you can acquire adjacent parcels at prices that reflect the reported value rather than the real one. You can push out neighboring claim holders who don't know what they're actually sitting on. You can do that across 30, 40, 50 claims over the course of 10 years, and the amount of money involved becomes enormous, Cole said. Douglas estimated it at somewhere north of $2 million. Improperly obtained land, underpaid royalties, fraudulently acquired claim rights. She looked at him. Over multiple counties, involving officials at the Territorial Mining Commission who were... She picked up another paper. He had names. Cole looked at the papers in her hands. He thought about what Otis had said. They weren't running a clean operation. He thought about Gideon Frey in his expensive gray suit standing on the Denison steps with a gavel. "How many people know you have these?" he said. "No one I've told, but..." She hesitated. Douglas wasn't careful enough. He was angry toward the end. He talked to someone he trusted, someone he thought he could trust. "I don't know who. He didn't tell me." 2 weeks after that conversation, he was dead. The barn was quiet except for the sounds of the horses. Augusta and Cole's older gelding, working their way through the hay and the adjacent stalls with the complete indifference to drama that horses generally maintain. "The man Frey brought to the auction," Cole said. "The one in the company coat." "I saw him." "You know who he is?" "His name is Harlan Speck. He works directly for Walter Hatch. That's Consolidated's principal owner. Speck is the man Hatch sends when something needs to be resolved cleanly." She said the word cleanly with a particular flatness that made clear what she thought it actually meant. He was at the inquest after Douglas died, watching. Not participating, just watching. Cole rubbed one hand across his jaw. He looked at the papers spread between them and thought about the specific shape of the problem. A company with $2 million in hidden profit and the willingness to use men like Speck to protect it. He thought about a $900 debt auction on the steps of the Denison building. They weren't just settling a debt, he said. No, they were solving a problem. Elena's voice was flat and clear. "I think Frey expected the auction to go to a company man, someone who would make sure I didn't cause any trouble, or to Stills, who would have kept me isolated enough that it wouldn't matter. Until those options fell through," Cole said. "Until you." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with that direct measuring quality, and for the first time he thought he understood what was actually underneath it. Not distrust of him specifically, but the careful vigilance of a woman who had learned that she was carrying something valuable and dangerous in equal measure, and who could not yet determine whether the man across from her was an ally or another kind of threat she hadn't anticipated. "I'm not going to ask you to trust me," Cole said. "That's going to take time, and you'd be right to make me earn it. But I need you to understand something about the situation." "What?" "If Speck was at that auction, they already know you're here. Frey wrote my name in his ledger. My spread is not a secret." Cole looked at the papers again. "We have time, maybe. They'll want to be careful about how they come at this because they don't know what you have or what you've done with it. But we don't have unlimited time." Elena nodded. She'd clearly already worked this out. "I know. Is there anyone you trust, outside of this property? Anyone who knows what's in those documents?" She was quiet for a moment. Douglas had a friend, a man named Garrett Wiley. He runs a small claim up near the Ridgecrest Road, about 16 miles north. He knew Douglas before Consolidated, before all of this. I don't know what Douglas told him, if anything, but he's honest. She paused. "I think he's honest." "I know Garrett Wiley," Cole said. "Not well, but I've met him. He came to my father's funeral." He thought for a moment. "All right, I want you to put those papers somewhere other than that bag." "Where?" Cole stood. "I'll show you." He'd built a dry storage compartment into the floor of the barn 6 years ago for feed samples and equipment receipts that he didn't want in the house. It was a simple thing, a square of boards set flush with the floor, with a peg fitting in a knothole, invisible if you didn't know it was there. He showed it to Elena, and she looked at it and then looked at him. "Otis knows about it," Cole said. "Nobody else." Elena looked at the compartment for a long moment. Then she took the bundle of papers and set them inside it, carefully, on top of the dry feed samples. Cole replaced the boards. That night he lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the property, the horses, the wind in the cottonwoods, the creek, and thinking about $2 million and the kind of men who accumulated it. 11 days after Elena and Clara arrived at the ranch, a rider came up the Harrow Creek Road. Cole was at the fence line on the south pasture when he saw the dust. By the time he got back to the yard, the rider had already dismounted. A young man in a clerk's jacket and tie, very out of place on a working ranch, sweating in the afternoon heat. "Mr. Cole Mercer?" the young man said. He was holding a leather satchel and trying to project a professional confidence that his expression wasn't quite matching. "That's me. I'm representing the legal offices of Stanhope and Greer, acting on behalf of Consolidated Territorial Mining Company." He opened the satchel and produced a document with a territorial seal at the top. "I'm here to deliver a notice regarding the debt settlement contract entered into on the 14th of this month." Cole took the document. He read it with the steady pace of someone who is making himself read carefully rather than quickly. It was dense with legal language, references to statutes, to the original Boone certification, to the terms of the auction. But the core of it was simple enough. Consolidated's attorneys were asserting that the contract Cole had purchased was void, on the grounds that a debt settlement contract under the applicable territorial statute could only be held by a party with a recognized legal interest in the underlying debt, and that Cole Mercer had no such recognized interest. In other words, they were claiming the contract was his only if they decided it was. "There's a hearing date," the young man said. He pointed to a line in the document. 3 weeks from today, before Justice Boone." Cole folded the document. "Boone," he said. "Yes, sir." "Right." Cole looked at the young man who was doing his best to look official and not quite managing it. "You want water before you go back?" The young man blinked. Yes, thank you." Cole got him water. After the rider left, he stood in the yard with the document in his hand and thought about Justice Aldrich Boone and the nature of hearings held before men who had already made their decision before the date was set. Elena came out of the house. She'd seen the rider from the window. Cole handed her the document without comment. She read it. Her jaw tightened once, briefly, then smoothed out. She handed it back. "Boone will rule against you," she said. "Yes. And then Frey comes back with spec. Probably." She looked at him. "What do you do?" Cole thought about it. "I find a lawyer who doesn't work for Consolidated. I file a counter-petition. I make noise in the right places so that whatever Boone rules, it's not the end of the road legally." He looked at the document again. "And I go see Garrett Wiley." He rode to Wiley's claim the next morning, alone, leaving Otis at the ranch with instructions that were mostly about being alert without alarming Elena unnecessarily. It was a 2-hour ride north through scrub country, the kind of landscape that didn't invite much sentiment. Dry hills, occasional juniper, the road rutted by the spring runoff and not yet repaired. He found Garrett Wiley where he expected to find him, which was at the entrance to his mine shaft with a sample bag over one shoulder and the look of a man who'd been underground since early morning. Wiley was 60 or so, built close to the ground, with a full gray beard and the particular squinting habit of men who spent time in dark places and came back to the light. He recognized Cole, frowned slightly in the way people frown when they're running through their memory trying to place something, and then extended a hand. "Cole Mercer," he said. "Last saw you at my father's funeral, 8 years back." "Right." Wiley studied him. "You didn't ride 16 miles to reminisce." "No?" Cole looked around the claim site. It was a modest operation, one shaft, one man, the kind of small, independent mine that Consolidated apparently found useful as a target. "You knew Douglas Hart." Wiley was quiet for a moment. His expression didn't change exactly, but it settled into something heavier. "Come up to the shack," he said. The shack was a single room at the edge of the claim, with a table and 2 chairs and a stove, and the accumulated disorder of a man who lived alone and had stopped caring about the organization of things. Wiley put a coffee pot on and sat down. Hart came to me about 10 months before he died, Wiley said without preamble. He was scared. I'd known Douglas for 15 years, and we came up through the same assay training program out of Calvert City, and I had never seen him scared like that. He'd found something in Consolidated's records that he wasn't supposed to find, and he knew that they knew he'd found it. He showed you the numbers? Some of them. The copper wash discrepancy was the biggest, but he'd found 3 or 4 others like it. Wiley poured coffee. He didn't seem surprised that Cole knew this. I told him to get out, leave the territory. He had a wife and a child on the way, and some documents aren't worth dying over. He didn't leave. He said he was going to take it to someone in the federal land office. He had a name, an agent out of the territorial capital who he thought was clean. Wiley set the coffee pot down. 2 weeks later, he fell off a ridge he'd walked 100 times. His voice was even, but his hands around his coffee cup were not quite steady. Cole said, "His wife has the documents, the full set." Wiley looked at him sharply. "Where is she?" "At my place." Another long pause. Wiley looked at his coffee. "They'll come for her. They've already started. Legal pressure first. They want the contract voided so they can reclaim her under the auction terms. When that doesn't work..." Cole left the rest of it unfinished. "It won't be legal pressure next," Wiley said. "No." Wiley sat back in his chair. He was quiet for long enough that Cole started to wonder if he'd gone somewhere in his head he wasn't coming back from quickly. Then he said, "The federal land agent Douglas had a name for. I wrote it down when Douglas told me. I've been carrying it in my pocket for 10 months, telling myself there's something I should do with it and not doing it." He looked at Cole with the uncomfortable honesty of a man confessing something he's not proud of. "I was afraid." "I know," Cole said. He said it without judgment because he'd thought hard enough about fear on his way north to know that 10 months was not an unreasonable amount of time to spend being afraid of something like this. "The name," he said. "Do you still have it?" Wiley reached into his jacket. He produced a folded scrap of paper, worn at the creases, and handed it across the table. Cole opened it. The name written on it was Edmund Farley, Federal Land and Resources Office, Territorial Capital. He refolded it and put it in his own pocket. "I can't promise this goes well," Cole said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know it." Wiley picked up his coffee again. "What do you need from me?" "Right now, just to know you're there, that there's someone other than me in my hand who knows the full picture." Wiley nodded. He looked out the small window of the shack at the scrub hills and the thin blue sky. "Douglas had bad judgment about some things," he said. "He was too trusting in some ways and too stubborn in others. But he was right about this." He looked back at Cole. "The numbers don't lie, Cole. Whatever else was wrong about the situation, what he found was real." Cole finished his coffee. He stood, shook Wiley's hand, and rode back south through the dry hills with the piece of paper in his pocket and the specific weight of a problem that was larger than he'd known yesterday and no smaller for being understood. 2 days after Cole's return from Wiley's claim, Harlan Speck came to Redstone Crossing. Cole didn't see him directly. He was at the ranch when it happened. What he heard, through the network of information that operates in small frontier towns through a combination of deliberate communication and pure gossip, was that a man in a dark coat had visited Justice Boone's office for about 40 minutes, had stopped at the Consolidated Land Office on Commerce Street for another half hour, and had then taken a room at the Redstone Hotel for 2 nights. It was Mabel Oates who sent word, of all people. Cole came in from the barn 2 mornings after Speck's arrival to find a boy of about 12 sitting on the porch fence, kicking his heels and eating an apple that Elena had apparently given him. "Mrs. Oates says to tell you the man in the dark coat asked around about the Harrow Creek Road," the boy said, as though reporting the weather. Cole gave the boy a dime and sent him back. He went inside and found Elena at the table with Clara and told her what the message said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long do you think we have? Before they make a move?" "I don't know. It depends on what they think they know about those documents." He sat down across from her. "If they knew the full extent of what Douglas collected, they'd have moved harder and faster. My read is they know Douglas found something, but they're not certain how much, and they're trying to resolve it quietly before it becomes a federal matter." "They're too late for that," Elena said. Cole looked at her. What do you mean? 3 days ago, while you were with Wiley, I wrote a letter. She said it evenly, watching his face. To the Federal Land and Resources Office at the Territorial Capital. I gave them Douglas's name, the nature of what he found, and enough specifics from the documents to make clear it was substantive. I didn't send the originals. I made copies of the 3 most significant discrepancy records. She paused. I sent it through the postal route that doesn't pass through Redstone Crossing, through Millhaven. Cole stared at her. I didn't tell you, she said, because I wanted it gone before I told you, so it couldn't be stopped. She held his gaze steadily. You were the one who said we didn't have unlimited time. There was a silence. Cole thought several things simultaneously. That she was right, that she should have told him, that the fact that she hadn't told him was not entirely unreasonable, given that she'd been operating alone for 10 months and trusting other people had not historically served her well, and that the letter was now out there regardless of how he felt about any of it. Edmund Farley, he said. That's the name I got from Wiley, at the Federal Land Office. Something shifted in Elena's expression. That's who I addressed it to, she said. Cole rubbed a hand over his face. Then he looked at her again. All right, he said. All right? We're past the point of strategy on that particular decision. The letter's gone. He thought, if Farley is clean, we've started something that could actually matter. If he's not, then we're in worse trouble than we were, Elena said. I know. I thought about that. I know you thought about it. He looked at her. At the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, the way she was braced for him to be angry or dismiss her judgment. He was neither. I would have done the same thing, he said. I probably should have done it before now. She blinked. It was a very small blink, but he caught it. The problem now, Cole said, is that Speck is in town, which means Consolidated is watching, which means if a federal agent comes out here to follow up on your letter, and he may, and soon, they'll see it. Can we warn Farley? Not without making contact that they could intercept. Cole thought. The letter's the opener. If Farley does his job, this goes somewhere that's out of Consolidated's reach, but between now and then, we're exposed, Elena said. Yes. She looked down at Clara, who was sitting on the table with a wooden spoon that she was examining with intense concentration. The baby grabbed the spoon with both hands and banged it once on the tabletop with tremendous satisfaction. Then we need to be ready, Elena said. Her voice was calm, not the shut-down stillness Cole had seen on the steps of the Dennison building 10 days ago. Something different, more present, more like a woman who has made a decision and found, in the making of it, some solid ground to stand on. Cole looked at her. He thought about Speck in the hotel room in town, doing whatever calculations men like Speck do when they're deciding how to handle a problem. He thought about the documents in the floor of the barn, and the letter traveling south through Millhaven, and a federal agent named Farley who may or may not be what they needed him to be. He thought about the auction steps and the $52 that remained in his account, and the specific shape of the gamble he'd made on that Tuesday morning in front of 40 people who thought they were watching a transaction. I need to talk to some of the neighboring ranchers, Cole said. Men I trust. I want people who know the situation in case something moves fast. Elena nodded. And I want you to write down everything you remember from those documents, he said. Not a copy, just a summary of what you know, in your own words. Something that's not in that floor compartment. In case they find the compartment. In case anything happens. She looked at him steadily. You're preparing for the worst. I'm preparing for what's likely, Cole said. There's a difference, but not always a comfortable one. Outside, the afternoon was turning toward evening, and the hills were going the color of dry rust, and somewhere on the Harrow Creek Road a horse was moving at a trot. Cole listened to it, the hoofbeats passing on the road, not turning up toward the property, continuing north. He breathed out. The evening came on and they ate supper together, Cole, Elena, Otis, Clara, and the meal was quiet but not uncomfortable. Otis had found, somewhere in his 50 years of accumulated practical knowledge, the specific skill of eating a meal quickly, but not obviously so, which Cole recognized as consideration for the fact that Clara was in her fussy pre-sleep window and Elena would need to step away. Elena appreciated it. Cole could see that she did, even though she didn't say so. After supper, Otis went to the bunkhouse and Cole sat at the table with the accounts while Elena settled Clara in the side room. When she came back, she sat down across from him, and they stayed there for a while in the quiet of the house. Not talking, just occupying the same space, which was its own kind of thing, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable exactly, just real. "You know what I keep thinking about," Elena said eventually. Cole looked up. "That auction." She was looking at the table. "I stood on those steps and I thought, this is the worst thing that has ever happened to me." Which is remarkable, really, because a lot of bad things had happened before that. She traced a small pattern on the tabletop with one finger, not looking at it. "And then you bid." Cole said nothing. "I was angry," she said. "At first. I know how it sounds, but I was angry because I didn't know what you were. I'd seen enough charity that came with conditions." "I know," Cole said. "And now I'm here. And those documents are in your barn floor, and a man named Speck is in the hotel in town." She stopped, looked at him. "And I trust you," she said. It came out like it cost her something to say it, like she was aware of what it cost her and had decided to spend it anyway. "I don't entirely know when that happened." Cole held her gaze. He thought about saying several things. He settled on, "I'm glad." Elena nodded. Once, short, the way she did things when she'd decided. She stood up and went to bed. Cole sat at the table a while longer. The lamp burned low. Outside, the property was quiet in the particular way of a place that has people in it who are still, that has animals content in their shelter, that has, for this moment, just this moment, the quality of a held breath. Cole turned down the lamp and went to bed himself. He didn't sleep well. That was fine. He didn't expect to. The letter reached Edmund Farley on a Wednesday. Cole didn't know that at the time. He found it out later, after everything. But it mattered, because Wednesday gave Farley 4 days to make some preliminary inquiries before word of those inquiries reached someone inside the territorial capital who passed it along to someone who worked for Walter Hatch. And from there it took less than 24 hours for Harlan Speck to check out of the Redstone Hotel and ride south toward the territorial capital for a meeting that Cole would never learn the full contents of. What Cole knew at the time was simpler and more immediate. Speck left town on a Thursday, and the following Monday, 2 men arrived at the ranch. Cole was splitting wood in the yard when they rode in. Not quietly, not trying to conceal themselves, which he recognized immediately as a specific kind of statement. Men who come quietly are trying to catch you off guard. Men who come openly and loudly are trying to make you feel watched, accountable, already surrounded by something you can't see the full shape of. These two had that quality. They were dressed well enough to suggest money behind them, and they tied their horses at the yard fence with the ease of men who assumed the permission of spaces they entered. The taller of the two produced a document before he even said good morning. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Caswell. I represent Stanhope and Greer on behalf of Consolidated Territorial Mining Company." He had the smooth, practiced delivery of a man who did this regularly. "I'm here to inform you that the hearing before Justice Boone has been moved to this Friday, 4 days from today." Cole set down the splitting maul. He took the document and read it the way he always read documents from these people, carefully and completely, while they waited and hoped he'd skim. The hearing date had indeed moved. More significantly, the document now contained additional language about the child, Clara, asserting that as a dependent of the estate and a minor with no legally recognized guardian other than the contract holder, her status was similarly subject to review. Cole kept his face neutral. "The original hearing was set for 3 weeks from the 14th, he said. "That's 11 days from now." "Scheduling matters required adjustment," Caswell said, with the particular smoothness of a man who has said this kind of thing many times and stopped caring whether anyone believed it. "Right." Cole folded the document. "Anything else?" Caswell looked at him steadily. "Mr. Mercer, I want to be direct with you. Consolidated has significant interests in this territory and a long institutional history. The matter of Mrs. Hart's contract is a straightforward legal question, and the resolution of that question will go one way regardless of the path taken. Cooperation at this stage would be—" He paused, selecting the word with care. "Practical." "Practical," Cole said. "For everyone involved." Cole looked at Caswell. Then he looked at the second man who had not spoken and whose function appeared to be purely architectural. He was there to make Caswell look like he had support behind him, which he did. "Tell Stanhope and Greer," Cole said, "that I'll have representation at the hearing." Caswell held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, short and businesslike, and both men remounted and rode back down the Harrow Creek Road without another word. Cole stood in the yard and watched the dust until it settled. Elena was in the doorway of the house. She'd heard most of it. "They moved the date," she said. "Friday." Her jaw tightened. "That's not enough time to get proper legal representation." "No," Cole said. "That's the point." He came inside and picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. "I'm going to town." "Now?" "Now." He looked at her. "I need you to stay here. Keep the bar on the door tonight and tell Otis everything I just told you." He paused. "Are the documents still in the floor?" "Yes." "Good. Leave them there." He thought for a moment. "The summary you wrote, the one in your own words." "It's inside the lining of my bag." "All right." He put on his jacket. He was moving with the particular focused efficiency that came from having thought something through and arrived at a decision he wasn't going back on. "I'll be back by nightfall." "Cole?" Her voice stopped him at the door. He turned. She looked at him with that measuring quality, but it was different now than it had been on the wagon 3 weeks ago. Less assessment, more something else. The particular expression of a person who understands that someone is about to do something risky on their behalf and does not know the right way to acknowledge it. "Be careful," she said. It was simple. It was the only thing she had that was adequate to the moment. "I'll try," he said, which was honest. In Redstone Crossing, Cole did 4 things. He went to see the only lawyer in town who did not have any documented connection to Consolidated, a man named Philip Hart, who ran a small general practice out of a cluttered office above the saddle shop, and who had a reputation for being principled to the point of occasional impracticality. He spent an hour with Hart going through the hearing document and explaining the situation in enough detail that Hart's eyebrows rose steadily through the first 15 minutes, and then stopped rising because they had apparently reached their limit. "Boone will rule against you," Hart said, which was the 3rd time Cole had heard that particular sentence in the last 3 weeks, and which had not become more encouraging with repetition. "I know. What I need is a procedural record. Objections entered, continuance requests filed, anything that documents that we contested this and were denied due process. If Farley moves on the federal angle, I want there to be a clear record of what Consolidated did here and how." Hart looked at him over his reading glasses. "That's a sophisticated strategy for a cattle rancher." "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Cole said. After Hart, Cole went to the telegraph office and sent a message to the Federal Land and Resources Office at the territorial capital, addressed to Edmund Farley, which read, "Matter previously communicated urgent. Hearing set Friday. Mercer, Harrow Creek, Redstone Crossing." 12 words. Short enough that it couldn't reveal much if intercepted, long enough to tell Farley that things were accelerating. The 3rd thing Cole did was visit 4 neighboring ranchers. Not all of them. The ones he thought would listen, and the ones he trusted not to talk to the wrong people before they'd had time to think. He went to Ben Alderman, who ran cattle on the west side of the ridge and had been in a dispute with Consolidated over a water access claim for 2 years. He went to Pete Sorrell and his brother Frank, who had a spread 6 miles south and whom Cole had known since they were all young men working other people's land. And he went to Ira Toombs, who was 70 years old and had been in the territory longer than any of them, and whose opinion, when he formed it, tended to settle things. Cole told each of them what he'd told no one in town except Hart. Not everything. Not the federal investigation, not Farley's name, but the shape of it. A widow with documents that Consolidated wanted suppressed. A corrupted hearing before a judge who owed them. Men coming to the property. Alderman said, "I knew something was wrong with how they handled that water claim. They had numbers I couldn't make sense of." Sorrell said, "What do you need from us?" Toombs said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Douglas Hart was an honest man. I bought timber from his brother for 10 years. If his wife says the documents are real, I believe her." Cole said the same thing to each of them. "I don't know when, I don't know exactly how, but if something moves fast, I may need people I can count on." Each of them said, in their own way, that he could count on them. He didn't know if that would matter. He drove home, hoping it would. The fourth thing he did in town was buy ammunition. The days between Monday and Friday had a particular texture, the specific quality of waiting that comes when you know something is coming and you don't know its exact shape or timing. Elena spent those days finishing the documentary summary she'd been writing, compiling everything she could recall from Douglas's records into a clean, sequential account. Cole watched her work at it in the evenings, sitting at the table with a focused stillness, writing in a hand that was small and precise, occasionally stopping to close her eyes and concentrate on pulling something back from memory. "You don't have to do that tonight," Cole said one evening, when it was late and Clara had been down for 2 hours. "I want it done," Elena said, without looking up. "If something happens before Friday..." "Nothing's going to happen before Friday. They want the legal cover. If something happens after Friday, then..." She kept writing. Douglas spent months on those documents, and they killed him for it. "I am not going to let those months be for nothing, because I was too tired to finish a summary." Cole looked at her. He thought about saying something and decided against it. Instead, he got up and refilled the lamp oil, which was running low, and sat back down with the accounts, which still needed work, and they spent another hour together in the quiet of the house, working separately at adjacent tables, which was its own kind of companionship. Otis had taken to sleeping in the barn. Cole had not asked him to. On Wednesday night, he'd noticed the bunkhouse light was out early, and when he checked the barn, Otis had set up a bedroll near the storage compartment with the practical simplicity of a man who has identified the most important thing in a given space and positioned himself accordingly. Cole stood at the barn door for a moment, looking at Otis's sleeping shape, and felt something he didn't have an exact word for. A compound thing, partly gratitude and partly the specific weight of knowing that people were trusting you with something they couldn't afford to lose. He went back inside without waking him. The hearing on Friday did not go well, which was not a surprise. Boone's courtroom was a single room attached to the back of the land office building, with wood plank walls and 4 rows of benches that seated maybe 30 people. Cole and Hart sat at one table. Caswell and a second Stanhope and Greer attorney sat at the other. There were perhaps 15 people in the benches, mostly townspeople who'd heard something was happening, plus Mabel Oates, who appeared to attend things like this as a matter of civic principle. Elena was not there. Cole had asked her to stay at the ranch. She had not been happy about it. He told her honestly, if the hearing went badly and they tried to use it as immediate grounds to reclaim her contract, he wanted her somewhere they couldn't reach her in the next hour. She'd accepted that. It hadn't made her happy. Boone was a man of about 60, with a broad face that had the quality of something that had once been expressive and had been trained out of it. He read through the documents with the deliberate pace of a man buying time for nothing in particular, and then he called the hearing to order in the flat, procedural voice of someone executing a foregone conclusion. Hart was good. Cole gave him that. Within the constraints of a rigged proceeding, Hart was genuinely good. He raised 4 specific objections to the moved hearing date, 2 challenges to the statutory language consolidated with citing, and a procedural motion requesting a 60-day continuance pending review by the Territorial Attorney General's office. He entered all of it into the record. He was clear and precise and made Caswell work for every response. Boone denied every motion. He did it in the same flat voice, with the same unhurried pace, like a man turning pages in a book he'd already read. The ruling, when it came, was what Cole had expected. The original auction contract was void on the grounds that Cole Mercer lacked proper legal standing as a debt claimant, and the matter of Elena Hart's indenture status was remanded to the Office of Consolidated Territorial's legal representatives for disposition. Disposition, a word that covered a lot of ground. Caswell and his colleague were already gathering their papers. Caswell caught Cole's eye across the room and gave him the small, satisfied nod of a man who has done what he came to do. Cole looked at him for a moment, then he looked away. Outside the courtroom, Hart gripped his arm. "I've got everything in the record, everything. If Farley acts..." "I know," Cole said. "Thank you, Philip." "Cole..." Hart hesitated. "Go straight back. Don't stop anywhere." Cole was already moving. He drove Augusta hard on the way back to the ranch, harder than he generally pushed her, and she seemed to understand the need for it. The Harrow Creek Road was empty in both directions. The afternoon sky was building into something dark in the northwest. Real weather this time, not just threat. He reached the ranch in just over an hour and came into the yard to find Otis at the fence and Elena on the porch with Clara and an expression that meant she'd been watching for him. "How bad?" she said. "Voided, as expected." Cole climbed down. "We need to talk about tonight." "Tonight?" Otis said. "They have a ruling now. Caswell will move on it fast. He'll want to execute before any federal response can complicate things." Cole looked at the darkening sky. "If they come, it'll be tonight or tomorrow. Tonight is more likely. They'll want darkness, and they'll want it before Boone's ruling has time to circulate." Otis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll send word to Alderman." "And Sorrel," Cole said. "Tell them. Tonight, or possible tonight. Tell them to come armed and don't make noise coming up the road." Otis nodded and went for his horse. Elena was looking at Cole steadily. "You knew this was coming." "I thought it was likely." "But you went to the hearing anyway." "For the record," Cole said. "And because not going would have looked like we had something to hide." He looked at her. "We need to move the documents." "Where?" He'd thought about this on the ride back. The floor compartment was the first place someone would check if they knew to look for something hidden. It needed to be somewhere less obvious, somewhere that looked like nothing. "The water barrel," he said. "The one by the south pasture gate. It's half empty. We seal the documents in oilskin and put them at the bottom." Elena thought for a moment. "If it rains tonight, if it rains, the barrel fills and the oilskin keeps them dry. If they search the property, a water barrel 20 yards from the house is not the first thing they open." He looked at her. "It's not perfect." "No," she agreed. "All right." They wrapped the documents in oilskin. Cole had a sheet of it in the barn, used for keeping tack dry, and secured it with cord. Then Cole carried the bundle out to the south pasture gate while Elena stayed inside with Clara. He lowered it into the barrel with a length of wire to the bottom and replaced the partial cover. The water was cold. He dried his hands on his jacket. When he came back inside, Elena was at the table. She had the summary papers in front of her and was folding them into a tight rectangle. She looked up. "I'm going to keep this one on me," she said. Cole understood. If they took the documents and somehow found the barrel, the summary, Elena's memory of the whole of it in her own handwriting, was still there. He nodded. "There's something else," Elena said. She was very still. "Those records include names, territorial officials, commission members, not just Consolidated's internal people." She looked at him. "If Farley investigates and we give him what we have, it goes very deep, Cole, deeper than Consolidated itself." "I know. And the people involved in that kind of exposure," she stopped. "They don't let things go quietly." "I know that too." Cole sat down across from her. "What are you asking me?" She looked at him. "I'm asking if you're sure. Because once this goes federal, if Farley moves, if there's an investigation, we are committed to the end of it. There's no stepping back." Cole looked at the table. He thought about $52 and a barn that needed repairs, and the way the hearing had felt, sitting in that room, listening to Boone's flat voice, denying everything with the casual confidence of a man who has never had to worry about consequences. He thought about Douglas Hart on a ridge he'd walked 100 times. "I was sure on the steps of the Dennison building," he said. "I've been sure every day since. That part hasn't changed." Elena held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded and put the folded summary inside her dress, against her side. The men came at just past midnight. There were 7 of them. Cole knew that because he counted them from the barn window. He'd moved there 2 hours earlier, once Otis had returned from alerting the Sorrels and Alderman, leaving Elena inside the house with the bar on the door and Clara in the side room, and a rifle that Cole had shown her how to reload. He'd showed her that the previous week without explaining why. She'd learned quickly and without comment, which told him she'd already understood why. They came up the Harrow Creek Road without lights, which told Cole they'd been here before, or someone who'd scouted for them had, because you didn't navigate that road in the dark without knowing it. There were horses and there was the sound of a wagon, which was significant. A wagon meant they'd come prepared to take things or people with them. Cole watched them come into the yard. Speck was among them. Cole couldn't see his face in the dark, but he recognized the silhouette. The particular way the man sat on a horse, upright and deliberate. The others spread into the yard in a practiced pattern, which told Cole these were not Consolidated's lawyers. These were men who did different work. One of them dismounted and went to the house door and knocked. "Mrs. Hart." The voice was even, professional. "This is Deputy Connors, under order of Justice Boone. We're here to execute a lawful transfer under the terms of—" "There is no deputy named Connors in this county," Cole said. He said it from the barn doorway, loud enough to carry across the yard. He had a rifle. He kept it down, not raised, which was a specific communication. "I'm not pointing it at you yet, but I want you to notice that I have it." The man at the door turned. Speck turned. The others adjusted. "Cole Mercer," Speck said. His voice was the first time Cole had actually heard it. Medium in pitch, neutral, the voice of a man who has learned to keep everything that would be useful out of it. "You're impeding the execution of a lawful order." "There's no lawful order here," Cole said. "There's a ruling from a judge who's been on Consolidated's payroll for the better part of a decade, and there are 7 men in my yard in the middle of the night who are not deputies." He stepped out of the barn doorway into the yard, staying in the edge of shadow where the moon didn't quite reach. "I want you to hear something." From the south and the east there were sounds. Horses. More than a few. Coming up the road and through the pasture gate, not fast, not alarmed, but steady and purposeful. Ben Alderman came in from the south road with 2 of his hands. The Sorrell brothers came through the east pasture with 3 more. Garrett Wiley rode in from the north, alone but present, which Cole had not expected, and which meant something specific about what Wiley had decided in the days since Cole's visit to his claim. Ira Toombs came last, slowly, on his old gray horse, with a rifle across his saddle and the unhurried bearing of a man who has lived long enough in a territory to feel some ownership of it. 12 men, plus Cole, against 7. The yard was very quiet for a long moment. Speck looked at the assembled ranchers. He looked at Cole. He was calculating. Cole could see it, the particular stillness of a man running numbers in his head. 7 to 13 was not impossible, but it was also not what he'd come prepared for, and more significantly, this was no longer a quiet removal in the dark. This was a confrontation with witnesses who had names and spreads and community standing. Whatever happened here now happened in front of people who would talk about it. "This isn't finished," Speck said. "I know," Cole said. "Go back and tell Hatch that." Another pause. Speck looked at the house, at the barred door, at the dark windows. Cole didn't know if Elena was watching. He thought she probably was. Speck said something quietly to the man nearest him. Then he turned his horse. They left. All 7 of them. The wagon and the horses and the men who weren't deputies, back down the Harrow Creek Road in the dark. Cole listened to the sound of them going until he couldn't hear it anymore. The yard exhaled. Alderman came up beside Cole. "They'll come back," he said. "Yes," Cole said, "with more." "Yes." Alderman was quiet for a moment. "I've had that water access dispute with Consolidated for 2 years. I've got documentation. Nothing like what you're describing, but numbers that don't add up. Things that were said in meetings that don't match what ended up in the filings." He looked at Cole. "If there's a federal investigation, I want to be part of it." "I'll tell Farley," Cole said. Ira Toombs had ridden up close enough to hear. He said, "Sorrell's brother had a claim that Consolidated bought off him for 1/3 of what it was worth. 3 years ago. He signed because they told him the territorial assessment supported their offer." He looked at Cole with the steady gaze of a very old man who has been patient long enough. "I think it's time this got looked at properly." Cole looked around the yard, at these men, at their faces in the dark, at the specific quality of people who have decided that something is enough. He thought about the letter Elena had sent to Farley. He thought about what she'd said. Once this goes federal, there's no stepping back. "One more thing," Wiley said. He dismounted and was standing at the edge of the group. He was looking at Cole with an expression that Cole recognized, the expression of a man who has been carrying something for too long and has decided to set it down. "When I told you I was afraid, I'd been sitting on Douglas's name for 10 months. "I know," Cole said. "I'm not afraid anymore," Wiley said simply. "I want to be on record saying what I know, what Douglas told me, what I've seen at the claim sites, all of it." He paused. "I should have done it 10 months ago." Cole put a hand on his shoulder briefly, then let go. You're doing it now. The men stayed for another hour, making sure Speck's group didn't double back. They talked in the yard, practical things, who had documentation of what, how to get it organized, whether to contact Farley directly or through Cole. Toombs knew a federal circuit marshal he'd dealt with years back, someone independent of the territorial apparatus. He offered to send him word. Otis came out of the barn and stood with the group, and at some point Elena opened the house door. She stood in the doorway with Clara on her hip. The baby had woken at some point during the commotion and was now wide awake, looking at the assembled men in the yard with that ancient infant consideration. And she looked at the faces of the ranchers who had come out in the dark on the word of a man they trusted and the outline of a situation they'd decided was worth showing up for. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, taking it in. Then Toombs turned toward her. He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something unexpected. He took off his hat, old-fashioned and deliberate, the way older men do things when they want to make clear they mean them. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "your husband did a honest work. I'm sorry it cost him what it did." Elena held the old man's gaze. Her face was doing something complicated that she was not quite controlling. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. "Thank you for being here." After the ranchers left, gradually, in pairs, back to their spreads and their sleep and their own preparations, Cole stood in the yard in the quiet. The weather that had been building from the northwest had moved through. A quick hard rain that had come and gone in 20 minutes, leaving the yard damp and the air clean and cold the way it gets after rain at elevation. Elena was still in the doorway. "Are you all right?" Cole said. "Yes." She looked at the empty road where the 7 men had gone. "You knew they'd come." "I thought tonight was likely." "And you got those men here." "They got themselves here," Cole said. "I just told them what was happening." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Toombs took his hat off," she said. "I saw." "That's—" She stopped. She looked down at Clara, who was starting to go heavy and drowsy against her shoulder in the way of very young children who have run out of alertness entirely. "I haven't had very many people take my side. As a general matter," Cole looked at her. In the aftermath of everything, the hearing, the waiting, the midnight confrontation in the yard, she looked tired in a way that was different from the exhaustion she'd arrived with 3 weeks ago. That had been the tiredness of someone who had been running for so long they'd forgotten there were other options. This was different. This was the tiredness of someone who had done something hard and come through the other side of it, and that was a tiredness you could rest from. "You have them now," Cole said. "For whatever it's worth." She looked at him. In the dark and the aftermath, and the cold, clean air that the rain had left behind, she looked at him the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to say something you've been thinking about for a while. "It's worth a lot," she said. She went back inside with the baby, and Cole stood in the yard for a few minutes longer, looking at the road and the hills and the sky, where the clouds were breaking and the stars were coming through in the gaps the way they do after weather, bright and very distant and entirely indifferent to everything happening below them. He was exhausted. He was $40 further into debt than he'd been that morning because Hart's fee was coming due. The barn needed 3 separate repairs that he hadn't gotten to this week. Speck would be back, and next time he'd come with more men and a better plan. None of that had changed. What had changed was this. 7 men had come into his yard at midnight with a wagon and the intent to take a woman and her infant daughter to whatever Consolidated had decided to do with them. And those 7 men had turned around and gone back the way they came. It wasn't a victory in any final sense, but it was something. It was the first time the direction had reversed. Cole went inside. He barred the door. He checked the fire, low, and banked for the night. He listened to the sounds of the house. Clara's breathing from the side room, the creak of the structure settling, the creak far below moving the way it always moved. He sat down in the chair by the fire and let himself be tired for a while. Tomorrow would start early. It always did. But tonight, for this particular hour, nothing was moving on the Harrow Creek Road, and the documents were safe in an oilskin at the bottom of a water barrel, and 12 men knew the shape of what was happening and had decided they were on the right side of it. Cole Mercer sat by the dying fire, and let that be enough for one night. Edmund Farley arrived in Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday, 12 days after the night in the yard. Cole didn't know he was coming. That was deliberate on Farley's part. The man had sent no advance word, had traveled under a name that wasn't his own on the stage from the territorial capital, and had taken a room at a boarding house on the north end of town rather than the hotel, which was where people who wanted to be seen in Redstone Crossing generally stayed. Cole found out about him the same way he found out about most things that happened in town, through the informal network that operated between the ranches and the commercial district, in this case through Mabel Oates, who had noticed a man she didn't recognize asking careful questions at the post office and had sent word to the Mercer place by her youngest son. Cole rode in that afternoon and found Farley at a corner table in the back of Callahan's eating house, working through a plate of beans and salt pork with the methodical attention of a man who has learned to eat when food is available, because the schedule of his work doesn't always guarantee it. He was younger than Cole had expected, mid-30s, lean, with a plain face and the kind of watchful quality around the eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time observing things without appearing to. Cole sat down across from him. Farley looked at him. "Cole Mercer," he said. Not a question. "Edmund Farley," Cole said. Farley looked around the room briefly. A habit, Cole recognized, the automatic check of a man who'd trained himself to know who else was present. The eating house was mostly empty at this hour. He looked back at Cole and said, "Your letter reached me on a Wednesday. I've been working since Thursday." "Working how?" Quietly. Farley set down his fork. "The discrepancies your letter described, I want you to know they're consistent with things we'd been seeing in territorial filings from 3 other counties. Patterns that individually looked like clerical errors. Collectively, they look like something else." "How long have you been seeing them?" Cole said. Farley's expression shifted slightly. The particular shift of a man deciding how honest to be. 14 months, he said. Cole looked at him. "I know," Farley said. "Douglas Hart came to my office 14 months ago. He had preliminary numbers, not the full documentation, but enough to open a file. I opened it. Then 2 weeks later, he was dead, and the file..." He stopped. "The file was reviewed by my supervisor and categorized as inconclusive pending further evidence." "Your supervisor," Cole said, "who has since been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his own conduct." Farley said it flatly, without apparent satisfaction. "That happened 4 days ago, which is part of why I'm here now rather than 6 months ago, and I understand what that means in terms of what Douglas Hart's family went through." Cole sat with that for a moment. He thought about Elena's face on the steps of the Dennison building. He thought about 10 months of Garrett Wiley carrying a scrap of paper in his pocket and being afraid to use it. He thought about what it cost, being the person standing in the gap between the thing that should happen and the thing that actually does, waiting for an institution to catch up with what was plainly true. "What do you need from us?" Cole said. "The documents, the originals, if you have them." Farley leaned forward slightly. "The copies Mrs. Hart sent me were sufficient to open a formal investigation. What I need now is the full evidentiary record, the assay numbers, the commission filings, the discrepancy calculations, and Mrs. Hart herself. Her testimony about what her husband told her, what she witnessed, what she knows about the timeline. That's going to be the spine of this." "There are other people," Cole said. "Neighboring ranchers with documentation of their own. Garrett Wiley. He was Douglas's colleague. He's willing to testify." Farley pulled out a small notebook. "Tell me," Cole told him. "All of it. Alderman's water access dispute, the Sorrell brothers' claim that had been bought at fraudulent valuation, Toombs's connection to the circuit marshal, Wiley's first-hand knowledge of Douglas's findings." Farley wrote steadily, asking occasional questions that were precise and well-constructed, the questions of a man who understood what he was building and what each piece of it needed to do. When Cole was finished, Farley sat back. He looked at his notes. "This is larger than I thought," he said, "not in terms of the existence of it. I always thought it was large, in terms of the number of people who have direct knowledge. Consolidated has been operating in this territory for a long time," Cole said. "When something operates that long and leaves that much damage, people notice. They just don't always know what to do with what they've noticed." Farley looked at him. "I want to come to your property tomorrow. I want to meet Mrs. Hart and retrieve the documents." "Come in the morning," Cole said. "Early. Alone? Bring whoever you need, but nobody who goes through the Consolidated Land Office. Farley gave him a look that said he understood exactly what Cole was referring to. Understood. Cole stood to go. Then he stopped. Farley. The agent looked up. Speck is still in the territory, Cole said. After the night at the ranch, the men he brought, they didn't go far. I've had 2 reports in the last week of riders on the Harrow Creek Road who weren't going anywhere specific. They're watching. Farley nodded. He'd clearly already been thinking about this. Once I take formal possession of the documents and Mrs. Hart gives a deposition, Consolidated's ability to act directly becomes significantly more constrained. They'll know the federal case exists. Moving against witnesses at that point becomes a federal crime on top of everything else, Cole said. Yes, Farley paused. But until then, tonight and tomorrow morning are the window, Cole said. I'll be there at first light, Farley said. About that, Cole told Elena that evening. She was quiet through most of it, sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, listening. Clara was in the side room, down for the night. Otis was in the barn. Outside, the Harrow Creek Road was empty and dark, though Cole had positioned himself during supper so he could see it from the kitchen window, and he hadn't stopped seeing it since. When Cole finished, Elena said, he had Douglas's file for 14 months. Yes. She looked at the cold coffee, and his supervisor buried it. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. I spent 10 months thinking I was alone in this, that there was no one who knew, no institution that would care. She looked up at Cole. The whole time, there was a file. Cole said carefully, the file wasn't getting anywhere. That's not the same as someone knowing and doing nothing. The man responsible for stopping it is being investigated himself. Farley was working with what he had. I know. She said it without bitterness, which he respected. I'm not angry at Farley. I'm just adjusting my understanding of how these things work. She looked back at the table. Douglas would be furious, she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something more complicated. He trusted that if he brought the right information to the right people, it would matter. He believed that, and he died for it. She paused. And he was right. It just took longer than he could afford. Cole didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. The documents, Elena said after a moment. Tomorrow morning, Cole said. I'll get them from the barrel at first light before Farley arrives. I want them out of the ground tonight only if I think we need to move fast. Elena nodded. She was already thinking ahead. Cole could see. Running through things the way she did. Practical and sequential. My testimony, she said. What Farley needs from me, it's not just what Douglas told me. It's what I remember from the documents themselves. The specific numbers. He'll have the documents. He'll have the documents and he'll need me to explain them, she said. I was the one who organized them after Douglas died. I'm the one who understands how they connect to each other. She looked at Cole. I need to be in that deposition. I know, I told Farley you'd be there. She nodded again. Then something else crossed her face. A slight shift that Cole had learned to read as the moment when she was working through something she hadn't said yet. Cole? She said. Yeah, what happens after? If this goes the way it should, investigation, prosecution, whatever comes of it, what happens to us? To this? She made a small gesture that encompassed the table, the house, the property outside. It was the first time she'd said us in reference to the two of them, and Cole was aware of it, the specific weight of the word in that context. He thought about the answer for a moment before he gave it. I don't know exactly, he said. The debt contract is voided, which means legally you're free regardless of how the investigation goes. The ranch is still here. Whatever work you've been doing here, he paused. You've made this place function better than it has in 3 years. The accounts are clean, the tax assessment's been filed for review. I know where my money goes for the first time in a long time. He looked at her. That's not nothing. That's not something I'd want to lose. Elena looked at him steadily. That's not what I was asking. Cole held her gaze. He understood what she was asking. He thought about how to answer it honestly, which was the only way he knew to answer things that mattered. I know, he said. I don't have a clean answer to what you were actually asking. Not yet. but I'd like to have that conversation when this is over and you're standing somewhere that isn't surrounded by all of this. He gestured vaguely at the general situation. When you have the actual choice, not just the available option. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The expression of someone who has received an honest answer and found, unexpectedly, that it was the right one. "All right," she said. "Done." Farley arrived at first light with two men, agents from the Federal Land Office, both of them quiet and professional, in the way that suggested they'd been doing this work long enough to have had the unnecessary parts trained out of them. Cole had the documents from the barrel by the time they arrived. The oilskin bundle sitting on the kitchen table, damp on the outside and dry within. Farley opened it carefully, spread the papers across the table, and went through them with a focused attention that reminded Cole of Elena doing the accounts. The same quality of someone for whom numbers are a language they think in naturally. He asked questions as he went, and Elena answered them with the precision of someone who had spent 10 months thinking about exactly this material. The deposition took most of the morning. Cole sat to one side and listened. He watched Farley and his colleagues build the record piece by piece, the copper wash numbers, the adjacent land acquisitions, the commission filing discrepancies across 3 counties, the timeline of Douglas Hart's discoveries, and the events that followed. Elena gave her testimony in the same voice she used for everything consequential, even, clear, specific. She did not dramatize. She did not editorialize. She stated what she knew and what she'd witnessed and what she'd concluded from the documents, and she kept those 3 categories distinct from each other, which Farley appreciated visibly. When she finished, Farley sat back. He looked at his colleagues. Something passed between them. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of people who have confirmed something they'd suspected and found it to be as serious as they'd feared. "Mrs. Hart," Farley said, "I want to be direct with you about what this means procedurally. We'll be filing for federal jurisdiction over the investigation within the week. That will trigger an automatic stay on any territorial proceedings related to your situation. Boone's ruling, the contract question, all of it. Federally, those things don't exist while this investigation is active." Elena nodded and consolidated. "We'll be serving preservation orders on their territorial offices by Friday. That means they cannot destroy, alter, or remove any records." Farley paused. "Walter Hatch will know by Friday that this is federal. His attorneys will know what that means." "What does it mean for Speck?" Cole said. Farley looked at him. "It means that anything Speck does to any party involved in this investigation, any witness, any person connected to the case, becomes a federal matter. Obstruction, intimidation, interference with witnesses." He let that sit for a moment. "Men like Speck are useful to their employers when they operate in the dark, in jurisdictional gaps that nobody's looking at closely. When the federal light comes on, they become liabilities." Cole thought about Speck on horseback in the yard, turning his horse and going back down the road. He thought about the calculation he'd seen happening behind the man's eyes. "He'll be gone by Friday," Cole said. "I expect so," Farley said. After Farley and his colleagues left, with the documents carefully bagged and receipted, and a signed deposition from Elena and a separate statement from Cole, the ranch was quiet in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Otis came in from the barn. The 4 of them sat at the kitchen table with coffee and a silence that was not uncomfortable but needed a moment to settle into its new shape. "That's it then," Otis said finally. "That's the beginning of it," Cole said. "The investigation is its own thing. Could take months." "But the danger part," Otis said. "Mostly," Cole said. "Yes." Otis drank his coffee. He had a particular quality, at moments of conclusion, of a man who feels things he has no particular interest in putting into words, but wants it noted that he's feeling them. He set the cup down and looked at Elena and said, "You did well in there." Elena looked at him. "You were in the barn." "I heard through the window," Otis said, without any apparent embarrassment. "You did well." Elena looked at her coffee. "I just told the truth," she said. "Douglas spent months building those records so the truth could be told. She stopped. "I didn't want it to have been for nothing." Otis nodded. That was the end of what he had to say about it, apparently, because he stood up and went back outside. Cole watched him go and thought that Otis's particular form of feeling was underrated. The weeks that followed had a different quality from the ones before. Not easier exactly, but less pressurized. The watching riders on the Harrow Creek Road disappeared within 4 days, which confirmed Cole's read of Speck as a man who understood when the parameters of a situation had changed past the point where his presence was useful. The legal challenge to Cole's contract was formally suspended when the federal jurisdiction filing went through. Hart sent a note saying simply, "Consolidated's attorneys have requested an indefinite continuance. Read into that what you will." Cole read into it that Stanhope and Greer had been told to manage their exposure and had decided the smartest way to do that was to stop actively doing things that added to it. Farley sent word twice during the first 2 weeks. Brief updates, nothing detailed, the kind of communication that said this is progressing without saying how. Then, on a Thursday 3 weeks after the deposition, he sent a longer message. Cole read it at the kitchen table with Elena beside him. She read it over his shoulder. The message said, "Federal warrants had been issued for 4 named executives of Consolidated Territorial Mining Company, including the head of their territorial land operations. Justice Aldrich Boone had been suspended from his position pending a judicial conduct review. 2 members of the Territorial Mining Commission had resigned. The Territorial Attorney General's office had opened a parallel investigation." Cole set the paper down. He was quiet for a moment. "Boone resigned," Elena said. "Suspended," Cole said. "For now." "That's enough," Elena said. "For now." Cole looked at her. She was reading the message again, more slowly. He watched her face move through whatever she was feeling. It was not simple joy, because simple joy would have been an inadequate response to something this complicated. It was something more layered than that. The satisfaction of a thing concluded, mixed with the specific grief of knowing what it had cost to get there, mixed with the knowledge that conclusion was not the same as restoration, that some things that had been broken in the course of this were broken in ways that didn't fully heal. "Douglas was right," she said finally. Quietly, to herself more than to Cole. "He was right," Cole said. She set the message down. She looked at her hands for a moment. "He would have hated how long it took," she said. "He was impatient. It was one of his less endearing qualities." She said it with the particular expression of someone remembering a person accurately rather than with the flattened reverence that death sometimes produces. "He would have wanted it to take 2 weeks, and then when it took longer, he would have made everyone around him miserable about it." "That sounds like an honest portrait," Cole said. "He was a complicated person." She looked up. "Most people are." Outside, Clara had discovered something interesting in the dirt near the porch steps and was investigating it with the total investment of an 8-month-old who has not yet learned that some things are not worth this much attention. Otis was watching her from the porch rail with the careful oversight of a man who has concluded that his job right now is to make sure the interesting thing is not a spider. Cole watched this through the window for a moment. "I have a question," Elena said. He looked back at her. "That first day," she said, "on the wagon. When I asked you why." She paused. "You said you saw what was happening and you didn't like it, and that was most of it." "Yes." "What was the rest of it?" She looked at him. "You said most of it. What was the part you didn't say?" Cole thought about that Tuesday morning, the crowd, the sky, the bidding going up in its methodical increments, Still's flat voice, the specific way Elena's hand had moved in circles on Clara's back without her permission. "The baby," he said, "watching you try to hold it together for her when everything around you was going wrong. I recognized something in that." He paused. "My mother did that. For years, when things were bad and my father was... when things were bad. She held it together for us in exactly that way." He looked at the table. "It's not a rational thing. I'm not saying it's a good reason to spend $560. It's the best reason I've ever heard," Elena said simply. Cole looked at her. She was looking back at him with that direct quality that had been measuring him since the beginning, and for the first time the measurement in it felt like it had reached a conclusion, like the calculation was finished and the answer was something she'd decided to trust. "Cole," she said. "Yes, I want to stay." She said it plainly. No softening, no qualification. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have somewhere else I could go. Millhaven. The land office there would take me back, and I have enough saved from what you've paid me that I could find a room and start over." She looked at him steadily. I want to stay because this is where I want to be. I want to be direct about that, so you know it's a choice. Cole held her gaze. He thought about what he'd said to her weeks ago. When you have the actual choice, not just the available option. He thought about the fact that she'd remembered it, had waited for it, had held the question until the situation resolved enough that the answer could be real. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she stood, collected the coffee cups, and went to the stove to refill them, moving through the kitchen with the ease of someone operating in a space that has become genuinely her own. Ben Alderman came by the following week with his documentation of the water access dispute. He sat at the table with Elena and went through it, and she helped him organize it into the format Farley's office had specified for supplementary submissions. Pete and Frank Sorrell came 2 days later with the records of their brother's claim sale. 3 years of paperwork that they'd kept because they'd always felt something was wrong with that transaction, without knowing exactly how to prove it. Garrett Wiley gave his formal testimony to Farley's team in the second week of the investigation. Cole heard about it afterward from Wiley himself, who rode down to the ranch on a bright cold afternoon and sat on the porch with Cole and told him about it with the specific relief of a man who has set down a weight he'd been carrying longer than was good for him. I told them everything, Wiley said. What Douglas showed me, what I saw at the claim sites, the things I noticed over the years that I told myself weren't my business. He looked at his hands. They were my business. I knew that the whole time. You're telling them now, Cole said. I'm telling them now. Wiley was quiet for a moment. Douglas had a phrase he used when he was frustrated with something, with a calculation that wouldn't come out right or a situation he couldn't figure out. He'd say, "The numbers don't lie, they just take a while to be heard." He looked out at the hills. I think about that. Cole thought about it too, after Wiley left. He thought about it that evening when he was checking the fence on the east pasture, alone with the sound of the wind and the particular low light of a winter afternoon. The numbers don't lie, they just take a while to be heard. It was the kind of thing that was true in a way that was also deeply inadequate. True in the abstract, in the long arc of things, and also devastating in the specific, because the time it took for the truth to be heard was not neutral time. It was time that cost people things they didn't get back. Douglas Hart had not gotten his time back. What remained was what could be built from what was left, which was not nothing. It was never nothing, but it was never the same as what had been possible before. Cole finished the fence and came back to the house as the light was going down, and he stood in the yard for a moment looking at the lights in the windows. The kitchen light where Elena would be starting supper, the side room where Clara would be finishing her pre-supper agitation. And he thought that the specific weight of the present moment was not something he could have predicted from the starting point of any of this. You can't see what's at the end of a decision when you're making it. You can only see whether the decision itself is the kind you can live with. He'd spent $560 on a Tuesday morning and ended up with something he hadn't known he was missing. He didn't have a clean way to articulate what that was. He knew it when he walked in the kitchen door, and Elena looked up from the stove and said, "There's a letter from Farley's office," and held it out to him, and he took it, and they stood together at the kitchen table reading it, and it said that Walter Hatch had been formally named as a subject of the federal investigation, and that the Territorial Mining Commission's records were under federal preservation order, and that a grand jury had been convened at the territorial capital. Clara, in the side room, made a sound of tremendous satisfaction about something she'd apparently accomplished. Cole and Elena looked at each other. "It's moving," Elena said. "It's moving," Cole said. Outside, Otis was coming in from the barn, and the evening was cold and clear, and somewhere down the road a coyote made its single-note call into the dark, and the house held the warmth of a fire and people in it, which was the oldest and most fundamental version of shelter there is. Not the walls, but the people. Not the roof, but the life underneath it. Cole set the letter on the table. He started to say something. Elena had already turned back to the stove. "Sit down," she said. "Supper's ready." He sat down. Otis came through the door, stamping cold off his boots. Clara's sounds from the side room resolved into the specific pitch that meant she'd decided she was ready to be picked up, which Elena went to address. Cole sat at the table in the warm kitchen and listened to the sounds of the house, all its ordinary, specific, unremarkable sounds, and thought that ordinary was underrated, that ordinary was what you were trying to get back to when everything else was stripped away. The investigation was moving. Boone was suspended. Hatch was named. And here, on the Harrow Creek Road, the fire was lit and the supper was on the table, and the accounts were clean and a ledger on the shelf, and a child was making sounds of imperative need from the next room, and none of that was history yet. All of it was still happening, still being built, still, at this particular moment, on this particular evening, entirely and unreservedly present. That was enough, more than enough. Cole Mercer sat at his kitchen table and waited for supper, and the evening came on around the house like something that intended to stay. The grand jury met for 11 days. Cole knew this because Farley sent word at the beginning and at the end, and in between there was nothing, just the ordinary work of the ranch and the ordinary rhythm of days that had found their shape after months of being shapeless. He fixed the barn. He negotiated a better rate with the Millbrook feed store. He checked the territorial tax assessment response that Elena had filed, which came back with a correction that amounted to a reduction of $22 per year, which was not transformative, but was real. He worked the cattle with Otis through the first cold weeks of early winter and came home each evening to a house that had the specific quality of a place where people have settled into each other without making a formal announcement about it. Elena had moved the side room around. She'd done it gradually, over several weeks, in the way that people rearrange spaces when they've stopped thinking of them as temporary. A shelf here, a hook there, a small piece of fabric across the window that changed the quality of the morning light in a way Cole didn't notice until he did, and then couldn't imagine the room without. Clara had developed a personality that was impossible to ignore, opinionated, physically ambitious, deeply committed to placing objects in her mouth that had no business being there. She had also developed a specific fondness for Otis that Otis pretended to find inconvenient and clearly did not. These were the textures of the days. Cole moved through them with a kind of attention he hadn't had before. Not the hypervigilance of the previous months, but something quieter and more sustaining. The attention of a person who has come through something and emerged with a clearer sense of what deserves to be noticed. When Farley's second message arrived, it came in the afternoon on a day when snow had been threatening since morning without following through. Cole was in the barn when Otis brought it, and he read it standing there with the cold coming through the open door and the horses pulling at their hay behind him. The grand jury had returned indictments on all four named executives of Consolidated Territorial Mining Company. Walter Hatch had been indicted on 11 counts of fraud, land theft, falsification of territorial records, and conspiracy. Harlan Speck had been indicted on 3 counts, including conspiracy to intimidate federal witnesses. The events of the night in the yard, formally documented through the testimony of Cole, Otis, Alderman, the Sorrell brothers, and Toombs. Justice Aldrich Boone had been referred to the Territorial Judicial Conduct Board with a recommendation for permanent removal. Cole read it twice. Then he folded it and went inside. Elena was at the table, working on something. She looked up when he came in and read his face before he said anything. He handed her the letter. She read it. He watched her face, the way it moved through the information carefully, the way her eyes stopped on certain names and held there. She didn't make a sound. When she finished, she set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a moment, and Cole sat across from her and waited. "Hatch," she said. 11 counts. Speck. 3, including the night here. She nodded slowly. She was doing that thing she did when she was processing something too large for quick response, going quiet in a way that was not absence, but its opposite, a full presence with the thing she was taking in. Clara, in the side room, was making the sounds of a child who has woken from a nap and is deciding whether this requires announcement. Elena didn't move yet. "Douglas," she said. Not a question. Not a statement exactly. Just his name, said in the particular way that people say the names of people they've lost when something happens that the lost person should have been there to see. Cole said, "He started this. Everything that happened. It started with him." Elena looked at the letter again. He didn't get to see it. No. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I used to be angry about that. In the months after he died, I was so angry." She looked up at Cole. Not just at Consolidated, at him, sometimes, for being the kind of man who couldn't leave it alone, who had to keep pulling at it even after it was clearly dangerous. She paused. "That's not a comfortable thing to admit." "It's an honest thing to admit," Cole said. "He made a choice that cost him everything," she said. And it cost Clara her father, and me. She stopped. But he was right. And what he built, the records, the numbers, the paper trail, that's what made all of this possible. Farley couldn't have moved without it. The grand jury couldn't have indicted without it. She looked at the letter. He knew that. I think he knew that if something happened to him, the work would still be there. That was why he was so careful about it. Cole thought about that. A man doing careful work in the knowledge that he might not be the one to see it through. Building something that would outlast him, and hoping it was enough. It was enough, Cole said. Elena held his gaze. Something moved through her expression that was not simple, grief and gratitude occupying the same space, which is one of the things that happens when life is complicated enough and long enough. She reached across the table and picked up the letter again, folded it, and held it in both hands. I want to keep this, she said. It's yours, Cole said. The consequences of the indictments moved through the territory in ways that took months to fully understand. Consolidated's land holdings were placed under federal receivership while the fraud cases worked through the courts. A territorial commission was convened to review land transactions and claim valuations going back 12 years, and 3 of its first 5 findings resulted in awards of back payments to former claim holders who had been bought out at fraudulent values, including the Sorrell family's brother, who received a settlement that was not quite what his claim had been worth, but was considerably more than what Consolidated had paid him for it. Ben Alderman's water access dispute was resolved in his favor within 2 months of the investigation going public. He came to the ranch to tell Cole about it in person, riding up the Harrow Creek Road on a bright January afternoon, with a particular quality about him that Cole recognized as the look of a man who has been fighting something for so long that winning it doesn't feel entirely real yet. 2 years, Alderman said, standing in the yard. 2 years of filings and hearings and being told the assessments didn't support my position. They used the same falsified numbers for everything, Cole said. I know that now. Alderman shook his head. I knew something was wrong the whole time. I just couldn't prove it on my own. He looked at Cole. You know what the worst part was? Not the money. The way they made you feel like you were crazy, like you were the one who couldn't read the numbers right. Cole knew exactly what he meant. There was a specific kind of damage that came from being told, repeatedly and with institutional authority, that your clear perception of a thing was wrong. It didn't just cost you the immediate fight. It eroded your confidence in your own judgment in ways that took a long time to rebuild. You weren't crazy, Cole said. No, Alderman said. I wasn't. They stood in the yard for a while, talking about what came next. Alderman's plans for the water access, what the federal receivership meant for land in the area, the slow reorganization of things that Consolidated had controlled for so long that the territory had stopped imagining what they might look like without that control. It was a large thing to reimagine. It didn't happen quickly, but it was happening. After Alderman left, Cole stood at the fence for a long time looking at the hills. The snow had finally come and gone, leaving the landscape in the particular state of early winter recovery, brown and tan and the gray-green of juniper, the creek lower now, the light thin and very clear. He thought about how different it looked from the morning of the auction, which had been summer bright and ugly in a specific way. He thought about how little you can see of a thing's shape when you're inside it. Apachicas. Philip Hart sent a formal notice in February. The Territorial Debt Commission, established as part of the remediation process following the Consolidated investigation, had reviewed the original auction contract entered on the 14th of the previous summer. The Commission's finding, the debt underlying the auction, the $942 attributed to Douglas Hart's estate, had been fraudulently constructed by Consolidated's legal team using inflated compound interest calculations applied to a base debt that itself contained irregularities in its origination documentation. In plain terms, the debt had been largely invented. The auction had not been a legitimate debt settlement. It had been a mechanism to gain control of Elena Hart, and through her, to suppress what she might know. The Commission's order voided all obligations arising from the auction, including the residual balance Cole had agreed to pay on the installment schedule. The full amount was discharged. Hart's note, appended to the Commission order in his careful handwriting, said simply, I thought you'd want to see this in writing. P.H. Cole brought the order to Elena in the kitchen. He set it on the table in front of her without explanation. She read it. She read it a second time. Then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at nothing for a moment, and Cole saw her throat move. "It was never real," she said. "No, they invented it. They manufactured a dead man's debt to—" She stopped. Her voice was very controlled, which told him how much it was costing her to keep it that way. "Yes," Cole said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, but her face was doing something that was the precursor to not being dry, and she was clearly deciding whether to let it. "Douglas died for a debt that didn't exist," she said. "They killed him to protect a lie, and then they put his wife on an auction block to protect the same lie. And the debt that justified the auction was something they made up." Cole sat down. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to that. It was what it was. The full ugliness of it, laid out in official language on a commission order, which somehow made it worse and better simultaneously. Worse because it was now undeniably documented, and better because documented meant it existed somewhere outside the interior of Elena's knowledge of it. Somewhere that could be pointed to and said, "This happened, and it was this bad, and the record will say so." "I want to tell you something," Elena said. She was looking at the commission order. Cole waited. "The night before the auction, before Frey came to where I was staying and told me what was happening the next morning, I had decided to run." She looked up. "I had Clara packed. I had everything in that bag, and I had figured out a route south that would get us out of the territory before anyone could file papers on us." She paused. "I didn't run because Clara got sick that night. Just a fever, nothing serious. But I didn't want to put her on the road in that state. So I waited, and by morning, it was too late." Cole looked at her. "If she hadn't gotten sick," Elena said, "I would have been gone. You would have gone to that auction and bid against Stills and—" She stopped. "I think about that sometimes, how close it was to going completely differently." "But it didn't," Cole said. "No." She held his gaze. "It didn't." She looked back at the commission order. "I used to think about luck the way most people do, as something random that has no obligation to fall your way. I still think that's true, but I've started to think there's a kind of luck that isn't random, that comes from the people who decide to show up." She looked at him again. "You showed up on the steps of the Dennison building. Farley kept the file even when his supervisor buried it. Wiley finally gave his testimony. Toombs came at midnight with a rifle across his saddle." She paused. "That kind of luck is made by people who decide something is worth their effort. That's different from the random kind." Cole thought about that. It was the kind of thing he would have been skeptical of once. The idea that you could characterize good outcomes as a form of chosen intervention rather than accident. But sitting across from this woman in this kitchen, with a commission order on the table that documented the machinery of what had tried to destroy her and failed, he thought she was probably right. Not entirely right. There was still randomness, still the fever that kept her in the territory long enough to be found, but right in the part that mattered. People showing up. People deciding that something was their business, even when it was easier to decide it wasn't. "Clara's the luckiest part," he said. Elena smiled, a real one. The kind that changed the whole shape of her face. "Don't tell her that. She already has too high an opinion of herself." So, they married in April, when the hills were beginning to go green and the creek was running high from the snowmelt, and the air had the quality of a season deciding to become itself in earnest. It was not a large event. Cole had not expected to get married again. He'd been married once before, years ago, briefly and badly, in a way that had closed something in him that he'd assumed would stay closed. He'd been wrong about that. Wrong specifically in the way you're wrong when you make a permanent conclusion from a temporary state, which is one of the most common mistakes people make and one of the hardest to recognize from the inside. Elena had said yes in February, on a cold evening after Clara was down, in the kitchen that had become the center of everything they were building, said it the way she said most important things, directly and without softening, which was the thing about her that Cole had come to trust most completely. "Before you ask," she'd said, "the answer is yes." Cole had looked at her. "I hadn't asked yet." "I know. I could tell you were working up to it." She looked at him with that slight expression, the one adjacent to a smile. "I decided to save us both the anxiety." He had laughed. Not the polite laugh of a person acknowledging something meant to be funny, but the actual kind, surprised and genuine and a little undignified.
which was the best kind. Elena had looked satisfied about that in a way that told him she'd known it would land that way.
The ceremony was on the south pasture, where the land flattened into a shelf with a long view of the hills, and the sky opened up in a way that made you feel small in the good way. The way that reminds you that the world is large and mostly indifferent to human trouble, which sounds like a hard thought but is actually a comfort, because it means your troubles are proportional to a very large denominator. Otis stood with Cole. Garrett Wiley came. The Sorrell brothers came, and Alderman, and Ira Toombs, who had dressed for the occasion in a way that suggested he'd located a good jacket he'd forgotten he owned. Philip Hart came with his wife, a woman of enormous practical energy who had taken to Elena immediately and had opinions about the ranch's accounting system that she and Elena had spent 2 separate evenings discussing at length. Mabel Oates came because Mabel Oates attended the meaningful events of the community as a matter of principle, and Cole had come to understand that her attendance was a form of civic endorsement that was worth more than it might look like. Farley sent a letter that arrived the day before, which said, among other things, that the first of the consolidated prosecutions had resulted in a guilty plea from the head of their territorial land operations, and that Walter Hatch's trial was expected to begin in June. He added, in a postscript that was more personal than the rest of the letter, that he thought Douglas Hart had been a brave man and that he hoped Mrs. Hart, he'd crossed that out and written the Mercer family, found something good on the other side of all of this. Elena read that letter twice and put it with the commission order in the box where she kept things that mattered. Clara, at the wedding, was 10 months old and in a state of vigorous locomotion that had recently become bipedal on a probationary basis. She spent most of the ceremony being rotated between adults, as she made her views on the proceedings known with the cheerful totality of a person who has no concept yet of occasion. She ended up in Toombs' arms for the part where the words were said, and Toombs held her with the careful deliberateness of a very old man who understands that he is holding something that will outlast him by many decades, and who finds that thought more comforting than melancholy. Cole stood in front of the people who had come and said what he meant to say to Elena, which was not elaborate, he'd never been elaborate, but which was specific and true, which he thought was better. He said that he hadn't expected her, that he hadn't expected any of this, and that he'd stopped some months ago thinking of what had happened as something that had been done to his life and started thinking of it as what his life actually was. He said that the difference between those 2 ways of looking at it was the difference between before and after, and that he preferred after. Elena said, I told you the answer was yes in February, so I won't make you wait again. And people laughed, and she said, I choose this. I choose you. I want that to be the first thing on the record and the last thing anyone doubts. That was all. It was sufficient. The things that happened afterward happened over time, which is how most things that actually last do happen. Not in a single moment of resolution, but across the accumulation of ordinary days that don't announce their significance while they're occurring. Hatch was convicted in June on 7 of the 11 counts. He received a sentence that the territorial papers called unprecedented in its severity for a commercial fraud case, which suggested to Cole that the judge had understood what $2 million in stolen land and falsified records actually meant in human terms, what it meant for families who'd been bought out at fraudulent prices, for claim holders who'd never known what they were sitting on, for the man who died on a ridge he knew too well. Sentences don't restore what was taken, and everyone involved understood that, but they create a different kind of record, the kind that says, this happened, and it was wrong, and the weight of it was real. Speck was convicted on all 3 counts. He served his time at the Territorial Penitentiary in conditions that were not, as far as Cole ever heard, notably comfortable. Boone was permanently removed from his position. He retired to a property in the southern part of the territory and was, by all accounts, not comfortable in his retirement, which Cole found he had limited sympathy for. Aldrich Boone had signed his name to the order that put Elena Hart on an auction block. Some things don't deserve comfort on the other side of them. The Territorial Mining Commission, reconstituted with members who had been vetted through the federal investigation process, began a systematic review of claim valuations across 3 counties. It was slow work. It found irregularities in 37 separate cases, resulting in settlements and back payments that collectively amounted to something in the range of $300,000 distributed among families and individuals who had been cheated over 12 years. The Sorrell family's brother used his settlement to buy back a portion of his original claim and found, as Douglas Hart's records had indicated, that it was worth considerably more than what he'd been told. Garrett Wiley expanded his operation. He hired 2 men and opened a second shaft, and within a year was producing at a rate that made the modest thing he'd been running look like a placeholder for what the claim had always been capable of. He came to the Mercer Ranch for supper occasionally, and sat at the table with the ease of a man who has found his way back to something he'd been circling for a long time, and talked about the work with the specific pleasure of someone for whom work has meaning beyond its product. One evening, sitting on the porch after supper with the last of the light going gold over the hills, Wiley said, "I've been thinking about Douglas." Cole was in the chair beside him. "What about him?" "He would have been good at this part," Wiley said. "The after part. He was always better at building than at fighting. The fighting was something he did because he thought he had to, not because he had any aptitude for it. But building things, working systems, making something run right." He paused. "He would have been very good at this." "He'd have wanted the credit," Elena said from behind them. She was in the doorway, leaning against the frame with Clara on her hip, and she'd clearly heard the last part of it. She said it without sharpness, with the specific warmth of someone who can speak honestly about a person they've lost, because enough time has passed that the honest parts and the loving parts don't feel contradictory anymore. Wiley smiled. He would have, extensively and at length. Elena came out and sat on the porch step, and they stayed there until the light was gone and the cold came up from the creek, and Clara fell asleep against her mother's shoulder with the profound and immediate surrender that very young children have, and the conversation moved through other things. The Commission's latest findings, the spring cattle prices, a fence section on Wiley's east boundary that was giving him trouble, and the evening settled around them with the particular texture of evenings that don't need to be significant to be good. This. There is something worth saying about what this all meant, separate from the facts of what happened. People make decisions in moments when the full cost of those decisions is not visible to them. Cole Mercer stood in a crowd on a Tuesday morning and made a decision that was not strategic, not calculated, not the product of any plan he'd formed in advance. He made it because he saw something that was wrong, and he was in a position to do something about it, and he chose to. That's the whole of the mechanics of it. What it cost him, the money, the months of danger, the nights watching the Harrow Creek Road, he couldn't have seen in advance, and knowing might not have changed anything, but the not knowing is part of what made the decision possible. You can think about what courage costs you after you've paid it. Thinking about it before is often just another name for finding reasons not to act. Elena Hart survived a year of being alone with a dangerous truth and an infant and no reliable ground under her feet, and she survived it not because she was without fear. She was afraid constantly. Anyone would have been. But because she kept doing the next necessary thing. She wrote the letter. She organized the documents. She gave the testimony. She made one small decision at a time in the direction of something better, without knowing if better was actually available. That is not inspiration. That is just stubbornness of a particular and necessary kind. The refusal to stop moving even when stopping would be easier. Douglas Hart built a paper trail that outlasted him. He was not a perfect man. Elena said so herself. And it's important that she could say so, that his memory was real enough to include the parts that were difficult. He was impatient and not always easy to be close to, and he made at least one decision in trusting the wrong person that contributed to what happened to him. But he also did something that required more than ordinary courage. He kept accurate records in a context where accuracy was dangerous, because he believed that what was true should eventually be documented, that the numbers shouldn't lie even when the people around them were lying constantly. That belief cost him his life. It also dismantled an empire. Both things are true, and neither cancels the other. The people who showed up in the yard at midnight with rifles and the willingness to stand there, Alderman, Wiley, the Sorrells, Toombs. They showed up because Cole asked them to, but also because they'd been watching the same corruption for years, and they'd been waiting, without quite knowing they were waiting, for a moment that made action feel possible rather than futile. That's what happens when enough people get tired of accepting what they've been told they have to accept. The opening doesn't announce itself in advance. It appears, and the people who were ready for it step through. Clara Mercer grew up in a house where both of these things were true. The world could be brutal in specific and organized ways, and ordinary people could push back against that brutality, and sometimes, not always, not easily, not without cost, change its direction. She grew up knowing her father by his work and his records and the stories Wiley told about him, and by the way her mother spoke about him when she spoke about him, honestly, with complexity, the way you speak about people who mattered to you before you understood all of what they were. She grew up knowing Cole as her father in the functional sense, the man who was there, the man whose patient and imperfect presence constituted what fathers are made of in practice rather than in concept. She grew up, in other words, with an accurate understanding of how the world works, that it contains both injustice and the possibility of its correction, that the correction requires people who decide to be part of it, and that choosing to be part of it is not a heroic abstraction, but a series of ordinary decisions made under uncertain conditions by imperfect people who are, most of them, more afraid than they look. That is what the ranch on Harrow Creek became. Not a legend, not a monument. A place where people who had been through something difficult lived their lives forward, doing the work of the day that was in front of them, and tried to do it with enough honesty and enough care that the day after would be slightly better than the one before. On a morning in the second autumn after the trial, Cole was at the fence on the south pasture when Elena walked out to him across the dry grass with Clara toddling alongside her, both of them in coats, the sky the particular blue of high country fall that has no equivalent in other seasons. He stopped what he was doing and watched them come. Clara had recently developed the opinion that she should be doing everything independently, which meant the walk from the house took considerably longer than it would have otherwise and involved 3 separate stops to investigate things on the ground. Elena walked at her pace without apparent impatience, not because she had unlimited patience, she didn't, nobody does, but because she had learned, as parents do, when the thing being investigated is worth the delay and when it isn't, and fall grass in the morning was worth it. Cole leaned on the fence post and waited. When they got close, Clara looked up and said, "Cole," with the specific precision of a child who has recently understood that words are tools and is applying this understanding with great enthusiasm. It wasn't the word he was called in formal terms, but it was what she'd arrived at on her own, and he had never seen any reason to correct it. "Morning," he said. "Otis says the east fence is down again," Elena said. "I know. I'll get to it this afternoon." She stood next to him and looked at the hills. Clara crouched down and began a serious examination of something near her feet. The creek was audible from here, lower than in spring but present, the constant sound of moving water that Cole had grown up with, and that had become, over the years, something he noticed most by its absence. "Farley sent another letter," Elena said. "What's it say?" The last of the commission reviews came back, the final tally on the remediation payments. She paused. 37 cases, $289,000 in total back payments, 11 families who got their land classifications corrected. She was quiet for a moment. "He says the territorial legislature is considering a reform to the claim valuation process, making independent verification mandatory." Cole absorbed that. "Douglas's numbers?" he said. "Douglas's numbers," Elena said, "running through 11 families and a legislative reform." She glanced at him sideways. "He'd want the credit for that too. He'd deserve it." "Yes," she said. "He would." They stood at the fence line for a while without talking. Clara stood up from her investigation, looked at both of them with the assessing quality she'd had since infancy, and then walked carefully to Cole and put both arms around his leg, which was her current preferred greeting, presumably because his leg was the most convenient part of him at her height. Cole put his hand on top of her head. She stayed there for a moment, then released him and went back to the grass. Elena watched this. "What are you thinking?" Cole said. She considered the question. "I'm thinking that I spent a long time believing that this—" She made a gesture that indicated herself, the ranch, the general situation. "That this kind of life wasn't for me. That I was always going to be on the outside of it, the wrong kind of woman for it, or the wrong circumstances, or whatever the current reason was." She looked at the hills. "I was wrong about that." "You were working with bad information," Cole said. She looked at him. "That's a generous way to put it." "It's the accurate way," he said. "The people who told you what you were worth, they had a vested interest in the answer being low. That's not a reflection of what you're actually worth." Elena held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away at the hills again, and the expression on her face was the kind that doesn't need any particular response.
the expression of a person arriving at something, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way water finds its level. "We should get back," she said. "The bread's going to need another hour, and I don't want to leave it." "Go ahead," Cole said. "I'll finish this section and be in before noon." She called Clara, who came with the specific reluctant cooperation of a toddler who has not finished what she was doing, but has weighed her options, and concluded that compliance is currently the practical choice. They walked back toward the house across the fall grass, and Cole watched them go. The woman and the child, the small figure trotting with the concentrated effort of short legs. The house behind them, with the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, and then he turned back to the fence and got back to work. The east section needed fixing. The cattle would need moving before the first real freeze. The accounts were in good shape, but the spring costs would need planning by December. There was always more to do than there were hours in the day for it, which was not a complaint. It was simply the terms of a life that is actually being lived, with actual things in it that require your attention and your effort and your presence. Cole Mercer fixed the fence in the cold, clear morning and thought about nothing in particular and everything in general, the way you think when you're doing work that your hands know and your mind is free to wander. He thought about the auction steps, briefly, with the distance that time provides. The crowd, the sky, the sound of the bidding, the decision that had not felt heroic in the moment because it hadn't been. It had felt like the only available response to something that was plainly wrong, which is usually what right decisions feel like from the inside. Not noble, just necessary. He finished the section and gathered his tools and walked back across the pasture toward the house, toward the smoke and the bread, and the sound of Clara's voice carrying out through the kitchen window in the particular register of a child who has something urgent to communicate. It was an ordinary morning. It was, in the specific way that ordinary mornings are when you've lived through enough extraordinary ones, more than enough. The hills stood against the sky. The creek ran below the pasture. The house held what it held. Cole Mercer came in from the cold and shut the door behind him, and the morning went on.